You would not have noticed the change if you had been awake and waiting for it. It happened too slowly for the eye to catch, but the skin of the chamber was aware of it. The sandstone, which had spent the night releasing the stored heat of the previous day back into the cooling air, now paused in that long exhalation. The temperature of the wall beside the sleeping mat stopped falling and held itself perfectly still for a long suspended moment, as if the rock itself were holding its breath before the return of the sun. This was the true beginning of the day in the high village above Petra, and it had nothing to do with roosters or calls to prayer or the stirring of animals. It was a geological event first and a human event only much later. The light, when it finally came, was not a beam but a seepage. The sky beyond the window opening shifted through a sequence of greys that had no names because no one had ever needed to distinguish between them. There was the grey that was still mostly night with only a memory of charcoal in it, and then there was the grey that held the faintest possible suggestion of warmth, like the colour of ash that has been cold for a day but still remembers the fire. And then there was the grey that was not grey at all, but the first intimation of the rose colour, for which the stone of this place was famous, although at this hour the rose was still a secret held inside the grey, and would not reveal itself for some time yet. You lay on a sleeping mat woven from palm fronds and covered with a single length of coarse wool that smelled faintly of lanolin and the smoke from the hearth niche. The mat was placed on a low raised platform of packed earth that had been smoothed and hardened by the weight of sleepers over more years than anyone in the village could count. Your head rested on a curved wooden headrest that kept your neck straight and your breathing open and your ear pressed against the slight hollow of the wood where the grain had been polished to a dull sheen by the oil from hair and skin. The position was ancient and comfortable in the way that things which have been done exactly the same way for thousands of years become comfortable not through design but through the deep familiarity of the body's memory. The first direct light of the morning sun did not enter the window. The angle was still too low, and the cliff face above the village created a long shadow that stretched far out across the valley floor. But the light that reflected from the opposite wall of the canyon began to find its way into the chamber as a soft ambient glow that had no source you could point to. It simply filled the space the way water fills a cistern, rising slowly and without disturbance from some unseen spring deep in the floor. The darkness did not flee from this light. It simply became thinner and thinner until it was no longer darkness, but only the memory of darkness held in the deepest grain of the wooden ceiling beam. A single particle of dust drifted through the still air of the chamber. It had been resting on the edge of the window opening for the entire night, held in place by the faint moisture that the cooling stone had released in the hours after sunset. Now, as the stone began to warm and the moisture began to retreat back into the microscopic pores of the sandstone, the particle lost its grip and floated free. It was a tiny flake of dried skin shed from the hand of someone who had passed through this room many days ago, or perhaps a fragment of wool fibre broken from the edge of a tunic, or a speck of the fine pale dust that blew up from the valley floor during the afternoon winds of the dry season. Its composition did not matter, and its journey had no purpose. It simply drifted. The particle moved so slowly that a person watching would have grown tired of watching before it travelled the width of a single finger. It rose a small distance on a current of air that was too faint to feel against the skin, and then it paused, as if reconsidering, and then it sank again by an even smaller distance, and then it drifted sideways toward the place where the new light was brightest. The light caught the particle, and for a moment the speck became a tiny floating star suspended in the column of pale gold that was now beginning to form on the eastern side of the chamber. Then it drifted out of the beam and disappeared back into the general dimness of the room and was forgotten. The column of light itself was the true subject of this hour. It began as a vague brightening on the stone floor near the base of the wall below the window. At first it was no more than a suggestion of warmth, a place where the cool grey of the stone seemed to be blushing very slightly toward a colour that had no name. The blush deepened slowly with the same patient inevitability as the tide coming in over a flat beach. The edge of the light moved across the floor with a speed that could be measured in the width of a barley grain over the span of 100 slow breaths. It was not something you saw happening. It was something you noticed had happened only after you looked away and looked back again. The light reached the edge of the woven wool rug that covered the center of the floor. The The rug was old, and its pattern had long since faded into a uniform brownish grey that matched the colour of the stone around it. The wool fibres were flattened and matted from countless footsteps, and the nap had been worn away entirely in a path that led from the sleeping platform to the doorway. The edge of the light touched the first row of knots at the rug's border, and the difference in texture between the smooth, cool stone and the rough, warm wool created a visible line of demarcation. On one side of the line, the stone was still grey and cool. On the other side, the wool was beginning to glow with a deep, earthy warmth that had been hidden in its fibres all night. You might have turned slightly on the mat in response to the changing quality of the air. The movement would have been slow and unconscious, the kind of adjustment the body makes without consulting the mind. Your shoulders shifted and your breathing changed its rhythm by a fraction, and your hand, which had been resting palm up beside your head, curled slightly inward, as if holding on to the last threads of a dream that was already evaporating. But you did not wake. The light was not yet strong enough to pull you from the depths, and the temperature of the room had not yet risen enough to signal to your skin that the time for rest was ending. The dust in the beam of light had multiplied now. What had been a single particle drifting alone had become a slow, gentle current of tiny, bright specks moving in a river of light that flowed from the window to the floor. They moved at different speeds and in different directions. Some rose straight up as if carried on a thermal of warmth from the stone beneath them. Some drifted laterally, pushed by the imperceptible movement of air that slicked through the crack beneath the wooden door. Some hung almost motionless, suspended in a perfect equilibrium of forces that cancelled each other out. The overall effect was of a slow, silent snowfall happening inside the room, a snowfall made of light and time and the fine debris of a world that was mostly quiet. The sunbeam crept further across the rug. It illuminated a section of the worn path where the wool had been compressed into a smooth, hard surface that reflected the light differently than the surrounding areas. The reflection was not bright enough to cast shadows. It was simply a change in the quality of the visible surface, a place where the light seemed to sink into the fibers and warm them from within, rather than bouncing off and continuing on its way. The edge of the light was soft and blurred because the sun itself was not a point source, but a broad disk, and the window opening was not sharp, but worn smooth by wind and sand over centuries. The transition from light to shadow took place over a span of several finger widths, and within that transition zone, the color of the rug shifted through a dozen subtle shades that had no names. Time in the high village was measured by this movement of light. There were no water clocks here, no marked candles burning down, no bells ringing from distant towers. There was only the crawl of the sunbeam across the floor in the morning and the corresponding crawl of the shadow line up the opposite wall in the afternoon. The people who lived in these rooms knew without thinking that when the light reached the third knot from the edge of the rug, it was time to rise. When it touched the leg of the small wooden stool in the corner, it was time to grind the morning grain. When it reached the base of the water jar, it was time to make the first descent to the cistern. These markers were as fixed and reliable as any mechanical device, and they required no winding, no maintenance, and no attention. They simply were. The light had now reached a small clay bowl that had been left on the rug the previous evening. The bowl was empty, except for a thin residue of olive oil that coated the bottom and the lower curve of the interior. The oil caught the light and held it in a way that the dry clay could not. A small patch of golden brightness appeared on the wall above the bowl, a reflection that was soft and diffuse and shaped like the ghost of the bowl itself. The reflection trembled slightly because the surface of the oil was not perfectly still. Some tiny vibration in the stone floor, a tremor too faint for any human sense to detect, was passing through the building and disturbing the liquid just enough to make the reflected light quiver, like a breath on the surface of a pond. The sound of a single rock dove cooing from somewhere higher up the cliff face drifted into the chamber. The sound was soft and round, and it seemed to come from very far away, even though the bird was probably perched on a ledge not 20 cubits above the window. The coo repeated 3 times with a long pause between each repetition. Then it stopped, and the silence returned, and the sound became a memory almost immediately. The dove had not announced the morning. The morning had already been underway for some time. The dove had simply added its voice to the morning the way a single drop of water adds itself to a cistern, and is immediately indistinguishable from all the other drops that have come before. Your breathing had changed again. The long, slow rhythm of deep sleep had given way to the slightly shallower, slightly quicker rhythm of the state that lies between sleeping and waking. Your eyelids fluttered, but did not open. The light was now bright enough that even through closed lids you could sense the change in the ambient glow. The darkness behind your eyes was no longer the true darkness of night. It was a warm, reddish darkness, the color of the inside of a pomegranate held up to the sun. This was the body's own signal that the rest period was drawing to its natural close, not because of any alarm or obligation, but because the body had simply rested enough and was ready to be still in a different way. The sunbeam had now traveled almost the full length of the rug. It had crossed the worn path and the faded pattern and the small clay bowl, and it was approaching the edge of the sleeping platform itself. The light climbed the low vertical rise of the packed earth and began to touch the edge of the palm frond mat. The fibers of the mat were dry and pale, and they caught the light differently than the wool of the rug. They seemed to glow from within as if the sun were not shining on them, but through them. The shadow of the mat's woven edge created a jagged line on the darker earth of the platform, a line that moved with the same imperceptible slowness as everything else in this room. The stone wall beside the sleeping platform had begun to warm. You could feel it if you reached out and pressed your palm against the surface. The sandstone was no longer cool to the touch. It had absorbed enough of the ambient warmth to register as neutral against the skin, neither warm nor cool, but exactly the temperature of a living hand. This was the moment when the wall and the body were in perfect equilibrium, and for a brief span of the morning, the distinction between the person and the place was blurred. You were part of the stone, and the stone was part of you, and the light that was slowly filling the room was filling you as well. The dust continued to drift in the beam. It would drift all day in different beams as the sun moved across the sky and the angle of the light through the window shifted. The particles that floated in the morning light would settle by afternoon, and new particles would rise to take their place, and the cycle would repeat tomorrow and the day after and the day after that. No one in the village ever remarked on the dust, unless it became thick enough to require sweeping. It was simply part of the air the way the scent of sun-warmed sandstone was part of the air, and the faint, distant smell of wild thyme from the hillside was part of the air. These things were the background of life, and the background of life was what filled the hours between waking and sleeping. The light touched your foot. It was a small warmth, a patch of brightness on the dark wall of the blanket that covered your legs. The warmth was not enough to wake you if you had still been deeply asleep, but you were no longer deeply asleep. You were floating in that shallow water just below the surface of consciousness, where sounds and sensations drift down from above and touch you lightly and then drift away again. The warmth on your foot was one such sensation. You registered it without thinking about it, and your foot moved slightly under the blanket, adjusting its position not to escape the warmth, but to settle more comfortably into it. The rock dove cooed again. The sound was exactly the same as before. It came from the same direction and lasted for the same duration, and was followed by the same long silence. There was no variation in the dove's call because there was no need for variation. The call was not a message. It was simply the sound that a rock dove makes when it is content and warm and perched on a ledge overlooking a wide valley in the early morning. The dove would make this sound many times throughout the day, and each time it would be the same sound, and each time it would fade into the same silence, and nothing would change because of it. You opened your eyes. The movement was slow and the light was not harsh because the direct sun still had not entered the window. The chamber was filled with a soft golden glow that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The ceiling beams were visible now, their dark wood textured with the marks of the ancient adze that had shaped them. The water jar in the corner had emerged from the darkness, and you could see the slight bulge of its middle, and the narrow neck, and the rolled rim where the potter's thumb had pressed the clay into its final form. The small clay bowl on the rug was clearly visible now, and the residue of oil in its bottom glistened with a dozen tiny points of reflected light. You did not rise. There was no reason to rise quickly. The morning would be long, and the tasks of the day were few, and none of them required haste. The grain could be ground later, the water could be fetched later, the goat could be checked on the hillside later. The sun would continue to move across the floor, and the wall would continue to warm, and the dust would continue to drift, and the dove would continue to coo. The village would remain exactly as it was suspended in the amber light of the early morning on the high cliffs above Petra, and you would remain where you were for a little while longer, watching the slow progress of the sunbeam as it climbed the wall, and marked the passage of another day that was exactly the same as all the days that had come before. The light was now on your hand. Your hand rested palm down on the wool blanket, and the skin of your knuckles was illuminated with a soft golden glow that made the fine hairs catch the light like tiny threads of spun glass. You watched your own hand as if it belonged to someone else, as if the hand and the light and the warmth and the silence were all part of a single still picture that had no need for movement or change. The weight of the light on your skin was not a physical weight, it was a weight of attention, a weight of presence, a weight of the simple fact of being here in this room on this morning in this village that had been carved from the cliff so long ago that the memory of its making had become just another layer of the soft, warm stone. The sunbeam continued to climb. It had reached the curve of the water jar now, and the terracotta surface was glowing with a deep orange warmth that seemed to come from inside the clay rather than from the light striking its surface. The jar was older than anyone in the village. It had been fired in a kiln somewhere down in the valley when the grandfather of the oldest person in the village was a child. It had held water from the same cistern for all those years, and the minerals in the water had slowly seeped into the porous clay and changed its color in subtle ways that no one noticed because the change had taken a lifetime to occur. The jar was a record of time, just as the wear on the stone floor was a record of time, and the fading of the rug's pattern was a record of time. Everything in the room was a record of time. Your eyes closed again, not because you were falling back to sleep, but because the warmth and the stillness and the soft golden light made it natural to rest in this way, with the eyes closed and the mind empty and the body simply present. The light continued to move across the room behind your closed lids, painting the darkness with shifting patterns of warm red and soft orange. The dove cooed one more time and then fell silent. The dust drifted. The wall warmed. And the long, slow morning of the high village continued exactly as it had always continued, since the first stone was set into the cliff, and the first sunbeam found its way through the first window, and the first sleeper opened their eyes to the weight of light on sandstone. The path to the cistern began at the back of the sleeping chamber, where a narrow opening had been cut through the living rock to connect the dwelling with the system of water channels and storage basins that made life possible in this high, dry place. The opening was not a door in the way that a wooden panel on leather hinges is a door. It was simply a place where the stone wall had been carved away to create a passage just wide enough for a single person to pass through while carrying a water jar balanced against one hip. The edges of the opening were smooth and rounded from the touch of countless shoulders brushing against them over the generations, and the stone here was a darker shade of rose than the stone in the main room, because the light from the window never reached this far into the interior. You stepped through the opening and into the corridor that led down. The change in temperature was immediate and unmistakable. The sleeping chamber had been warm with the accumulated heat of the morning sun, and the body heat of the night, and the slow respiration of the sandstone walls. The corridor was cool in a way that had nothing to do with shade. It was the cool of the deep earth, the cool of stone that had never felt the direct touch of the sun since the day it was first laid down as sediment on the floor of an ancient sea. The air here smelled different too. It smelled of damp limestone and the faint mineral tang of water that had been filtering through rock for centuries, and the clean, empty scent of a space where nothing grows and nothing decays. The floor of the corridor sloped downward at a gentle angle that had been carefully calculated by the original builders to make the descent easy on the knees and the return climb manageable even with a full jar of water. The slope was so gentle that you could walk it without thinking about your feet, and the surface of the stone had been worn into a shallow depression in the center, where the traffic of centuries had passed. Your bare feet found this depression without conscious guidance, settling into the groove that fit the curve of the human foot as perfectly as if it had been carved for that purpose. The stone was cool against your soles, but not unpleasantly so, and the coolness traveled up through the bones of your feet and into your ankles with each slow step downward. The light in the corridor came from small openings cut into the outer face of the cliff at irregular intervals. These openings were not windows in the conventional sense. They were narrow vertical slits just wide enough to admit a blade of light and a thread of fresh air from the valley outside. The builders had placed them where the natural fissures in the rock made the cutting easier rather than according to any regular pattern, and the result was a corridor illuminated in patches and pools with long stretches of near darkness between each source of light. You walked from brightness into shadow and then back into brightness again, and the rhythm of this alternation became as natural as breathing after the first few turns of the passage. The first slit opened onto a view of the valley floor far below. The light that entered here was strong and golden, and it fell across the corridor floor in a sharp diagonal stripe that climbed the opposite wall and disappeared into the darkness of the ceiling. Dust motes floated in this beam of light, just as they had floated in the beam in the sleeping chamber, but here the dust was different. It was heavier and damper, and it moved more slowly, as if the weight of the water in the air was pressing down on it. The particles drifted through the light and then passed into the shadow beyond and were lost to sight, and the beam remained empty for a moment before new particles drifted in to take their place. Your hand brushed against the wall as you walked. The stone here was damp to the touch. Not wet in the way that a stream is wet, but damp in the way that a cloth left in a cool cellar is damp. The moisture had condensed on the surface of the rock from the slow exhalation of the water stored deeper in the cistern system, and it gave the stone a texture that was slightly softer than the dry stone of the upper chambers. Your fingertips left faint marks in the condensation marks that would fade within moments as the moisture redistributed itself across the surface. The wall was covered with such marks from all the hands that had passed this way over the years, and none of them remained visible for long enough to be seen by the next person who came after. The sound of the cistern began to reach you after the third turn of the corridor. At first, it was not a sound at all, but only a change in the quality of the silence. The silence of the upper corridor had been complete and absolute, broken only by the soft pad of your own feet on the stone. The silence here was different. It was a listening silence, a silence that seemed to be waiting for something. And then as you descended further and the corridor made another gentle turn, you heard it. A single drop of water falling from somewhere in the darkness ahead and landing on a surface of water with a sound that was so faint and so pure and so perfect that it seemed to have been designed by the stone itself. The drip came again after a long pause. The interval between drops was not regular in the way that a clock is regular. It varied by small fractions of the moment, depending on the temperature of the rock and the level of the water in the cistern and the exact path that the seepage took through the microscopic fissures in the ceiling. Sometimes 2 drops would fall in quick succession, almost overlapping. Sometimes the pause would stretch out so long that you began to wonder if the dripping had stopped entirely, and then, just as you were about to accept the silence as permanent, another drop would fall and the sound would ripple outward through the stone and the air in the darkness. The corridor opened into the cistern chamber without any threshold or doorway. One moment you were walking through the narrow passage with the walls close on either side, and the next moment the space expanded around you into a volume that you could feel rather than see. The darkness here was not the shallow darkness of a room without windows. It was the deep darkness of the underground, the darkness that has been undisturbed by light for so long that it has become a substance in itself, a presence that fills the space as completely as water fills a bowl. You stopped walking because you had reached the edge of the stone platform that ringed the cistern basin, and you knew without seeing that one more step would take you into the water. Your eyes adjusted slowly to the darkness. The adjustment was not a matter of the pupils dilating. It was a matter of learning to see without light, to perceive the space through other senses, and to build a picture of the chamber from sound and touch and the faint pressure of the air against your skin. The cistern chamber was roughly circular with a domed ceiling that had been carved to follow the natural curve of a bubble in the ancient rock. The walls were covered with a thin layer of calcium carbonate deposited by the water over centuries, and this layer caught the faintest possible gleam from the distant light of the corridor behind you. The gleam was not enough to see by, but it was enough to give the darkness a texture, a sense of depth and distance that pure blackness lacks. The water itself was invisible. It occupied the center of the chamber in a basin that had been carved deep into the floor and lined with smooth hydraulic plaster that the old builders had made from crushed limestone and volcanic ash. The surface of the water was perfectly still. The drop that fell from the ceiling disturbed it only for an instant, creating a single expanding ring that traveled outward and vanished against the stone edge before the next drop fell. Between drops, the water was a mirror of absolute darkness, reflecting the darkness of the ceiling and the darkness of the walls and the darkness of your own shape, standing motionless at the edge of the platform. You knelt on the stone platform and reached for the rope that hung from a wooden peg driven into a crack in the wall. The rope was made of twisted palm fiber, and it had been in use for so long that the fibers had become smooth and hard and dark with the oil from countless hands. The rope passed through a simple pulley made from a forked branch that had been wedged into a natural crevice in the ceiling. The pulley creaked faintly when you touched the rope, a sound that was absorbed immediately by the damp stone and the still water and the heavy air. The sound did not echo. There was nothing in this chamber that could echo. There was nothing in this chamber that could echo. The stone and the water and the darkness swallowed every sound the moment it was made. The bucket was made of goat skin stretched over a wooden frame and sealed with bitumen along the seams. It floated on the surface of the water somewhere out in the darkness, and you could feel its weight through the rope as a slight tension, a gentle pull that told you the bucket was empty and waiting. You began to pull the rope hand over hand, drawing the bucket toward the edge of the platform. The motion was slow and steady and repetitive. Left hand reached forward and closed around the rope. Right hand released and moved back. Left hand pulled. Right hand released and moved back. Left hand pulled. Right hand reached forward. The rhythm was ancient and it required no thought. Your mind could drift while your hands performed the task that hands had performed in this same chamber since before the memory of anyone alive. The bucket reached the edge of the platform and you lifted it from the water with a smooth motion that brought it to rest on the stone beside your knee. The water inside was cold. You could feel the cold radiating through the goat skin and the wooden frame and into the stone beneath it. The cold was not the cold of winter. It was the cold of the deep earth, the cold of water that has been resting in darkness for months and that will remain at the same temperature regardless of the season above. The water had fallen as rain on the high plateau many months ago, and it had traveled slowly through the cracks and fissures of the mountain until it found its way into this chamber. It would remain here until it was drawn out jar by jar and carried up to the village, and then new rain would fall and the cycle would continue. You filled the clay jar that you had carried down from the sleeping chamber. The jar was large, and when it was full it would be heavy enough to require both hands and careful balance on the climb back up. The water poured from the goatskin bucket into the narrow mouth of the jar with a sound that was different from the drip of the ceiling. It was a fuller sound, a rounder sound, the sound of water finding its level in a contained space. The jar filled slowly, and the sound changed as the water rose from a hollow gurgle to a soft splash to a quiet trickle and finally to silence as the last of the bucket's contents drained into the jar and the surface of the water settled just below the rolled rim. You sat for a moment on the edge of the platform with the full jar beside you. The darkness of the cistern chamber wrapped around you like a heavy blanket. The drip from the ceiling continued its irregular rhythm, marking time in a way that had nothing to do with the sun or the moon or the seasons. The drip had been falling for longer than anyone knew. It would continue falling after everyone now alive was gone. It was the heartbeat of the mountain, and it was slow and patient and indifferent to everything except the slow seepage of water through stone. Your hand rested on the curve of the full jar. The clay was cool and slightly damp from the condensation that had formed on its surface when the cold water chilled the terracotta. The dampness felt good against your palm after the climb down through the dry warmth of the upper corridors. You could feel the weight of the water inside the jar as a solid presence, a mass that would require effort to lift and carry. But for now the jar rested on the stone and you rested beside it, and the drip fell from the ceiling and the darkness held everything in a perfect stillness that asked nothing and expected nothing. The climb back up would be slow. The jar would be heavy against your hip, and your feet would find the worn groove in the center of the corridor, and you would stop once or twice on the way to rest and to let the muscles of your arms recover. The light from the slit windows would fall across your path in the same sharp diagonal stripes, and the dust would drift in the beams, and the stone would warm gradually as you rose toward the surface. The dove would coo from its ledge somewhere above, and the sun would have moved further across the floor of the sleeping chamber by the time you returned. The water would be poured into the smaller jar in the corner, and the large jar would be set aside to be carried down again when the level in the small jar fell low. And the cistern would continue to breathe its slow breath, and the drip would continue to fall, and nothing would change. You stood and lifted the jar. The weight settled against your hip and your arm curved around the bulge of the vessel, and your hand found the small handle that the potter had shaped for this purpose. The jar was balanced now, and you turned toward the corridor and began the slow ascent. Your footsteps were heavier on the return journey because of the weight of the water, and the sound of your feet on the stone was a deeper sound, a more solid sound. The first slit of light appeared ahead, and you walked toward it and through it, and into the shadow beyond. The cistern chamber receded behind you, and the sound of the drip grew fainter and then faded entirely, and the corridor was silent again, except for the soft rhythm of your own movement. The second slit of light was brighter than the first, because the sun had risen higher while you were in the darkness below. The beam fell across the corridor and illuminated a section of the wall where the calcium deposits had formed a pattern that looked like the branches of a tree frozen in stone. You paused here for a moment and shifted the weight of the jar to your other hip, and felt the coolness of the water through the clay and the slight give of the condensation under your fingertips. Then you continued upward, and the light fell behind you and the corridor grew dim again. The third slit of light marked the place where the corridor began to level out, and the slope became gentler, and the ceiling rose to meet the height of the upper chambers. The air here was warmer and drier, and it smelled of sun-warmed stone and the faint distant scent of wild thyme from the hillside. The water in the jar had begun to warm slightly from the heat of your body and the heat of the air and the heat of the stone walls. It would not be cold by the time you reached the sleeping chamber. It would be cool enough to be pleasant to drink, but not so cold as to shock the teeth. This was the temperature that water always had in the village water, that had been drawn from the deep cistern and carried up through the warm corridors and set to rest in the shaded corner of the room. The opening to the sleeping chamber appeared ahead as a rectangle of soft golden light. You stepped through, and the space of the room expanded around you, and the weight of the jar seemed suddenly greater now that you were no longer in the enclosed corridor. You crossed the worn wool rug and lowered the jar to its place in the corner beside the smaller water vessel. The stone floor here was warm from the sun that had been shining through the window all morning, and the warmth rose up through your feet and into your legs. You poured a small amount of the fresh water into the smaller jar, and the sound of the pouring was the only sound in the room. You sat on the edge of the sleeping platform and looked at the jar standing in the corner. The terracotta glowed with the same deep orange warmth that it had glowed with earlier when the sunbeam had touched it. The water inside was invisible, but you could feel its presence as a cool center hidden within the warm clay. The cistern was far below now, and the drip was still falling in the darkness, and the water you had carried up was just one small portion of the vast, slow reservoir that sustained the village. Tomorrow you would make the descent again, and the day after that, and the day after that. The rope would be in the same place, and the bucket would float on the same dark surface, and the drip would fall with the same irregular rhythm. And you would sit on the stone platform in the perfect darkness and listen to the slow breath of the cistern and feel the cold of the deep earth through the goat skin of the bucket. And nothing would be different from today, and nothing needed to be different. The water would continue to seep through the mountain, and the village would continue to draw it up, and the long, slow morning would continue to pass in the same quiet way that it had always passed. The heat of midday in the high village was not a heat that pressed down from above. It was a heat that rose up from below, from the stone floors and the stone walls and the stone terraces that had been baking in the direct sun since early morning. The air inside the sleeping chamber had grown thick and still, and the light that entered through the window had changed from the soft golden glow of dawn to a hard white brightness that bleached the color from everything it touched. The rug on the floor looked faded and pale, and the water jar in the corner seemed to have retreated into itself, pulling its terracotta warmth inward, as if to protect the coolness of the water within. The dove had fallen silent hours ago, and nothing moved on the hillside outside except the slow shimmer of heat rising from the valley floor far below. You sat on the low stone ledge that ran along the back wall of the chamber, where the shadows were deepest, and the air was marginally cooler than the air in the center of the room. The ledge had been carved from the same living sandstone as the rest of the dwelling, and its surface was worn smooth by generations of people sitting in this exact spot to perform the same task that you were about to perform. The task was the grinding of the grain, and it was the central stillness of the day, the fixed point around which all the other quiet activities of the household turned. The grinding stone rested on a slightly raised platform of packed earth that had been shaped to hold it at the perfect height for a seated person. The platform was old, and its edges had been rounded by the brush of countless garments and the scuff of countless feet. The grinding apparatus consisted of 2 stones. The lower stone was large and heavy and fixed in place, its upper surface worn into a gentle concave curve by the friction of the upper stone moving across it over years and decades and generations. The upper stone was smaller and oval-shaped, and it fit into the curve of 2 hands, with a familiarity that seemed to be built into the stone itself. A wooden handle had been fitted into a socket near one edge, and the wood was dark and polished from the oil of palms and the constant pressure of grip. The grain waited in a wide, shallow basket woven from palm fronds and lined with a piece of worn linen cloth. The grain was emmer wheat, an ancient variety with tough husks and small dense kernels that had been grown on the narrow terraces below the village, where the soil was thin and the water was scarce, and the plants learned to survive by growing slowly and holding tightly to what nourishment they could find. The kernels were a pale brown color with darker streaks running through them, and they smelled of dry earth and sunlight and the faint sweet dust of the threshing floor. You reached into the basket and let a handful of grain trickle through your fingers back into the pile, and the sound was a soft rustling whisper, like the sound of a light rain falling on dry leaves. You began by pouring a small amount of grain onto the center of the lower stone. The kernels scattered slightly as they fell, some rolling toward the edge, and some settling into the shallow depression in the middle. You gathered them back with a sweep of your palm, pushing them into a loose pile that would feed slowly under the upper stone as the grinding progressed. The stone was warm to the touch from the ambient heat of the room, but not unpleasantly so. It was the warmth of a thing that has been resting in the shade all morning, absorbing the temperature of the air without ever being struck directly by the sun. You lifted the upper stone and settled it onto the pile of grain. The weight of the stone pressed down, and you could hear the faint crackle of the kernels shifting and settling under the pressure. You placed your hands on the stone with your left palm flat against the curved surface and your right hand gripping the wooden handle. The position was ancient, and your body fell into it without thought. Your shoulders relaxed, and your back straightened slightly, and your breathing slowed to match the rhythm that was about to begin. The first movement was always the same. You pushed the upper stone away from you with a steady pressure, and it slid across the lower stone with a low grinding sound that was more felt than heard. The sound traveled up through the bones of your hands and into your wrists and your arms, and it was the sound of stone against stone, with a thin layer of grain caught between them. The kernels cracked and split under the weight and the friction, and the fragments of husk and endosperm were crushed and sheared and reduced to something smaller than they had been a moment before. You pulled the stone back toward you, and the sound repeated in reverse, and the first small pile of coarse flour began to accumulate at the edges of the grinding surface. The rhythm established itself quickly. Push away and pull back. Push away and pull back. The motion came from your shoulders rather than your arms, and it was a smooth, continuous circle rather than a back-and-forth line. The upper stone traveled in an oval path that matched the shape of the lower stone, and your hands guided it along this path without conscious direction. Your mind was free to drift while your body performed the work, and this was the purpose of the midday grinding. It was not a task that required attention. It was a task that occupied the body so that the mind could rest in the deep, still center of the hottest part of the day. The sound of the grinding changed as the grain broke down. The initial cracking of whole kernels produced a sharper, rougher sound, a sound of hard things being broken by harder things. As the fragments grew smaller and the flour began to accumulate, the sound softened and deepened, becoming a smooth, continuous rumble that was almost like the purring of some great stone animal. This sound filled the chamber and spilled out through the window and blended with the shimmer of heat outside until it became impossible to tell where the sound of the grinding ended and the sound of the afternoon silence began. Dust rose from the grinding surface in a fine, pale cloud that hovered just above the stones. The dust was composed of the smallest particles of flour and husk, and the microscopic fragments of stone that had been worn away from the grinding surfaces over countless sessions of this same work. The dust caught the light from the window and glowed with a soft golden color that made it look like smoke from a fire that burned without heat. The dust rose slowly because the air in the chamber was so still that even the smallest particle could drift for a long time before settling. It hung in a flat layer at the height of your face, and you breathed it in without noticing, because it was simply part of the air of this room and had been part of the air of this room for as long as anyone could remember. The flour accumulated slowly at the edges of the lower stone. You paused every few minutes to sweep it back toward the center with the edge of your hand and to add more grain from the basket. The pile of whole kernels grew smaller, and the pile of coarse flour grew larger, and the rhythm of the grinding continued without variation. The heat of the room pressed in from all sides, and a thin sheen of moisture formed on your forehead and your upper lip. The moisture was not sweat in the way that labor produces sweat. It was simply the body's response to the ambient warmth, a slow exhalation of water through the skin that evaporated almost immediately in the dry air. The light from the window had shifted since you began. The sun had moved across the sky, and the beam that had been falling on the far wall earlier in the morning was now falling on the floor near the grinding platform. The edge of the light crept closer with each passing minute, and you watched its progress in the moments when you paused to sweep the flour back toward the center. The light moved at the same slow pace as everything else in the village at midday, and it would reach the edge of the grinding stone just about the time when the basket of grain was empty and the grinding was finished. This was another of the unmarked measures of time that governed the day, and it required no attention and no calculation. It simply was. The grain beneath the upper stone had been reduced to a coarse brown flour that was still warm from the friction of the grinding. The warmth surprised you every time, even though you had done this work hundreds of times before. The stone itself remained cool to the touch, but the flour that emerged from between the stones held the heat of the grinding process, as if the act of breaking the kernels had released some stored energy that had been locked inside them since they ripened on the terrace. You lifted a small pinch of the flour and let it fall back onto the pile, and it fell in a slow stream that was heavier than dust, but lighter than sand. The upper stone made its final circuit of the lower stone, and you lifted it away and set it aside on the platform. The grinding surface of the lower stone was now covered with a thin layer of flour that clung to the stone in the pattern of the upper stone's path. The pattern was a pale oval on the darker stone, and it looked like the ghost of the motion that had created it. You used a small flat piece of wood to scrape the flour into a pile at the center of the stone, and the scraping sound was different from the grinding sound. It was a cleaner sound, a sharper sound, the sound of wood moving across stone with only the finest powder between them. You scooped the flour into a wide, shallow bowl that had been waiting beside the grinding platform. The bowl was made of the same terracotta clay as the water jar, and its interior was warm smooth from the repeated passage of fingers and scraping tools. The flour filled the bowl about halfway, and you pressed it down gently with the flat of your hand to settle it and to make room for the remainder. The flour was warm against your palm, and it left a fine pale coating on your skin that would take several washings to fully remove. The basket of grain was empty now, except for a few stray kernels that had lodged themselves in the weave of the palm fronds. You picked these out, one by one, and added them to the bowl, and they sat on top of the flour like small brown stones on a pale beach. They would be ground tomorrow with the next batch of grain, and they would become part of the flour, that would become part of the bread, that would become part of the body, that would grind more grain. The cycle was complete and unbroken, and it asked nothing more than patience and the willingness to sit in the still heat of midday while the stone turned against stone. The dust had begun to settle now that the grinding had stopped. The fine pale cloud that had hung in the air above the stones was slowly descending, spreading itself in an even layer over every surface in the chamber. It settled on the rug and on the water jar and on the wooden headrest beside the sleeping platform. It settled on your arms and your clothing and the fine hairs inside your nose. It settled on the window ledge where it would be stirred up again by the next breath of wind that found its way through the opening. The dust was everywhere, and it had always been everywhere, and it was as much a part of the room as the stone walls and the woven rug and the warm still air. You sat for a while longer on the stone ledge with the bowl of flour resting in your lap. The heat of the day had reached its peak, and the world outside was silent except for the faint distant buzz of some insect that had found a patch of shade and was singing to itself in the stillness. The grinding stone sat on its platform, and the upper stone rested beside it, and the basket waited empty in its corner. Everything was in its place and everything was still, and the long, slow afternoon stretched out ahead with nothing to fill it except more stillness. The flour in the bowl would be mixed with water from the jar and a pinch of salt from the small clay pot on the ledge, and it would become dough. The The dough would rest in the shade while the afternoon cooled, and then it would be shaped into flat rounds and baked on the hot stones of the hearth when the evening came. But that was later, and later did not exist in the midday stillness. There was only the weight of the bowl in your lap, and the warmth of the flour through the clay, and the soft pale dust that continued to settle on everything with the patience of something that had no need to hurry. Your eyes grew heavy, and you let them close. The darkness behind your lids was warm and reddish from the light that filtered through the thin skin. The sound of the insect outside continued its steady buzz, and the sound was so constant that it became silence after a few moments. You could feel the heat of the day pressing against you from all sides, and you could feel the coolness of the stone ledge beneath you, and you could feel the weight of the flour in the bowl, and you could feel nothing else, because there was nothing else to feel. The village slept through the hottest part of the day, and you slept with it, and the grinding stone waited on its platform for tomorrow, when the same hands would take up the same motion, and the same dust would rise into the same still air, and nothing would have changed at all. The courtyard was not a courtyard in the way that a palace has a courtyard with fountains and columns and patterned tiles underfoot. It was simply a space between the cliff face and the front wall of the dwelling where the rock had been leveled by ancient hands to create a flat area just large enough for a person to work in the shade. A goat hair awning had been stretched across the space from iron hooks driven into the stone above the doorway to wooden posts set into the edge of the terrace. The awning was old, and its black fibers had been bleached by years of sun to a deep brownish grey that matched the color of the rock walls. The hair was coarse and stiff, and it smelled of the animals it had come from, and of wood smoke, and of the fine pale dust that settled on everything in the village. The shade under the awning was not complete darkness, but a filtered dimness that softened the edges of things. The sun found its way through the gaps in the weave and through the places where the fibers had worn thin, and it fell on the packed earth floor in a scattering of small bright spots that moved almost imperceptibly as the awning stirred in the faint breeze. The spots of light shifted and danced without sound, and they made patterns on the ground that changed so slowly that you could not see them changing. Only notice after a long while that the pattern was different from what it had been before. The loom stood against the back wall of the courtyard, where the shadow was deepest and the stone was coolest. It was a standing loom of the kind that had been used in these mountains for as long as anyone could remember, a simple frame of cedar wood brought up from the valley floor many generations ago. The wood was dark with age and smooth from handling, and it smelled faintly of the resin that still lived somewhere deep in its fibers. The frame consisted of two upright posts with a crossbeam at the top and another at the bottom, and the whole structure leaned slightly back against the wall in a way that made it seem as if it had grown there rather than having been placed. The warp threads hung vertically from the top crossbeam to the bottom, and they were stretched tight with small clay weights tied to their lower ends. The weights were simple lumps of fired clay shaped roughly into discs with holes through their centers, and they hung in a long row, swaying slightly when the breeze found its way under the awning. The threads themselves were of undyed wool from the village goats, a brownish cream color that varied slightly from thread to thread, depending on the age of the animal and the season of shearing and the particular patch of hillside where it had grazed. The variation was so subtle that it could only be seen when you looked at the warp for a long time and let your eyes adjust to the fine differences between one strand and the next. You sat on a low three-legged stool that had been placed in front of the loom. The stool was made of the same cedar wood as the frame, and its seat had been worn into a shallow depression that fit the curve of a seated body, with the same quiet precision as the groove in the cistern corridor fit the curve of a foot. The wood was warm from the ambient heat of the afternoon, but not unpleasantly so, and you settled onto it with the weight of someone who expected to remain in this position for a long while. The shuttle rested on the crossbar of the loom where it had been left at the end of the previous session. It was a smooth piece of olive wood, shaped like a narrow boat, with a hollowed center where the weft thread was wound around a small removable pin. The wood was a pale golden color with darker streaks running through it, and it had been polished by the constant passage through the warp until it gleamed softly even in the dim light of the shaded courtyard. The weft thread was the same undyed wool as the warp, and it was wound tightly around the pin in a neat cylinder that would feed out slowly as the shuttle traveled back and forth. The beater hung from the upper part of the loom frame, suspended by leather cords that allowed it to swing freely. It was a heavy piece of hardwood with a row of evenly spaced teeth along its lower edge, and the teeth were worn to a smooth polish where they had passed between the warp threads thousands and thousands of times. The beater was the part of the loom that did the work of pushing each new weft thread into place against the growing fabric, and its weight was perfectly balanced, so that a single firm pull would send it swinging forward to press the thread home, and then it would fall back on its cords to wait for the next pass of the shuttle. You reached for the shuttle and lifted it from the crossbar. The wood was warm and smooth in your hand, and your fingers found the familiar curves without looking. The shuttle fit into your palm as if it had been shaped for your hand specifically, even though it had been shaped by some unknown woodworker long before you were born and had passed through the hands of many weavers since. You turned it slightly and checked the tension of the weft thread and found it exactly as it should be, neither too tight nor too loose, but feeding freely from the pin, with just enough resistance to keep the thread from tangling. The heddle rod hung in front of the warp, a simple wooden bar with loops of cord attached at regular intervals. Each loop encircled one of the warp threads, and when the rod was lifted, it raised those threads and created an opening between them and the threads that remained in place. This opening was called the shed, and it was the space through which the shuttle would pass, carrying the weft thread across the width of the fabric. You reached up and lifted the heddle rod with one hand, and the shed opened. Before you a long, narrow triangle of space that ran from the top of the loom to the bottom, with the raised threads above and the stationary threads below. The shuttle entered the shed from the right side, and you pushed it through with a smooth motion that sent it gliding across the width of the warp. The shuttle traveled through the opening without touching the threads on either side, because the shed held them apart with perfect precision. The weft thread unspooled from the pin in a thin, continuous line that trailed behind the shuttle and lay across the open shed. The shuttle reached your left hand, and you caught it without looking and set it down on the crossbar on that side, while your right hand reached for the beater. You pulled the beater toward you with a firm, steady motion, and the heavy wooden bar swung forward on its leather cords. The teeth of the beater passed between the warp threads and caught the new weft thread and pushed it down against the row of weaving that had come before. The sound of the beater striking home was a soft, solid thump that travelled through the wood of the loom and into the stone of the wall and disappeared into the deep silence of the courtyard. The sound was not loud. It was simply the sound of one thing meeting another thing with exactly the right amount of force and then stopping. You released the heddle rod, and the raised threads fell back into place. Then you lifted the other heddle rod, which controlled the alternate set of warp threads, and a new shed opened in the opposite configuration. The threads that had been raised before were now stationary, and the threads that had been stationary before were now raised. The shuttle waited on the left side of the loom, and you picked it up and sent it back through the new shed from left to right. The weft thread unspooled behind it, and the shuttle reached your right hand, and you set it down and pulled the beater again. The thump came again, and another thread was pressed into place against the growing fabric. This was the rhythm of the weaving. Shuttle through shed and beater forward, shuttle back through opposite shed and beater forward again. Each complete cycle added one thread to the width of the fabric, and the fabric grew by a thickness that was almost too small to measure. A full afternoon of weaving would add perhaps the width of 2 fingers to the length of cloth hanging from the lower beam. A full season of afternoons would produce a piece of fabric long enough to serve as a blanket, or a garment, or a covering for a doorway. The pace was slow, and it could not be hurried, because the shuttle would tangle if it moved too fast, and the beater would not seat the thread properly if it was pulled too hard. The loom set its own rhythm, and the weaver learned to follow it. The sound of the beater became a kind of heartbeat for the courtyard. Thump and pause and thump and pause and thump and thump. Between the thumps there was the softer sound of the shuttle sliding through the shed, and the faint creak of the leather cords, and the occasional soft tap of a clay weight bumping against its neighbour when the breeze stirred. The sounds blended together into a single continuous texture that was as much a part of the afternoon as the heat and the dust and the scattered spots of light on the packed earth floor. Your hands moved without your mind attending to them. The left hand lifted the heddle rod, while the right hand reached for the shuttle, and the shuttle crossed, and the right hand reached for the beater, while the left hand released the rod. The sequence repeated in reverse and then repeated again. The motion was ancient, and your body had learned it so thoroughly that it required no conscious direction. Your thoughts could drift away from the courtyard entirely, and the weaving would continue without interruption, because your hands knew what to do, and the loom knew what to do, and the thread knew what to do, and the thread knew what to do. The fabric that hung from the lower beam was a record of all the hours that had been spent at this loom. The lower portion was older and darker, because it had been exposed to the dust and the smoke of the dwelling for longer. The upper portion was newer and lighter, and the transition between them was so gradual that no line could be drawn between one and the other. The fabric was the same color as the thread, because no dye had been used, and the only variation was the subtle difference between one fleece and another, and the slight darkening that came with age. The texture was even and regular because the rhythm of the weaving had been even and regular, and the hands that had guided the shuttle had been patient and unhurried. A small moth fluttered under the awning and settled on the upper beam of the loom. Its wings were pale dusty brown that matched the color of the goat hair awning, and it folded them flat against its body and became almost invisible against the dark wood. It rested there without moving, and you noticed it only because your eyes happened to pass over that spot in the moment when your mind was between thoughts. The moth would remain there for a long time, waiting for the cool of evening, when it would fly out into the courtyard and search for whatever moths search for in the fading light. For now it was simply another still presence in the still afternoon, another small life waiting out the heat in the deep shade of the awning. The thread on the shuttle pin grew thinner as the afternoon passed. The neat cylinder of wound wool gradually decreased in diameter, and you could feel the difference in the weight of the shuttle as it crossed from hand to hand. When the thread became too thin to work properly, you would stop and wind a new length onto the pin from the larger ball of wool that waited in a basket beside the stool. The winding would take a few minutes, and it was a task that required a different kind of attention. The thread had to be wound evenly and with the right tension, and the pin had to be filled just enough so that the shuttle would pass freely through the shed without catching. Then the pin would be set back into the shuttle, and the weaving would resume, and the rhythm would continue exactly as before. The spots of light on the ground had shifted while you worked. The sun had moved across the sky, and the angle of the light through the awning had changed, and the pattern of bright specks was now falling closer to the front edge of the courtyard. Some of the spots had merged into larger patches, and some had disappeared entirely, as the gaps in the awning aligned differently with the sun. The light was softer now, with a hint of the golden quality that came in the late afternoon when the sun began its slow descent toward the western rim of the valley. The heat was still present, but it had lost its hard midday edge, and the air under the awning felt slightly less heavy than it had an hour ago. Your back was straight and your shoulders were relaxed, and your breathing was slow and deep. The position on the low stool was comfortable, in the way that a position becomes comfortable when it is held for a long time without moving. The muscles of your arms and hands moved in their familiar patterns, and the rest of your body was still. The stillness spread outward from the stool and filled the courtyard and the dwelling and the village and the valley beyond. Everything was still except for the slow motion of the shuttle and the beater and the spots of light on the ground. The fabric grew by another thread, and then another, and then another. The accumulation was invisible in the moment, but it was real, and it would be visible later when you stood up from the stool and looked at the length of cloth hanging from the beam. The difference between the cloth at the beginning of the afternoon and the cloth at the end would be small but measurable. It was the kind of progress that could only be seen by someone who had been present for the whole process, someone who had watched each thread being laid down and pressed into place. To anyone else, the cloth would simply be cloth, and the hours that had gone into its making would be invisible. The moth on the upper beam stirred and opened its wings slightly. It held them half open for a moment, showing the faint pattern of darker lines that marked the dusty brown surface. Then it closed them again and settled back into stillness. The moth had moved perhaps the width of a finger, and the movement had taken several minutes to complete. It was living at the same pace as everything else in the courtyard, at the same pace as the weaving and the shifting light and the slow cooling of the afternoon air. You reached the end of the weft thread on the shuttle, and you set the shuttle down on the crossbar and took up the pin and the ball of wool from the basket. The winding was a quiet task that required both hands, and you turned slightly on the stool to catch the better light from the edge of the awning. The wool unspooled from the ball in a thin, continuous strand, and you wound it around the pin with a steady, even pressure. The strand crossed over itself in neat diagonal layers that built up gradually into a cylinder of the right thickness. When the pin was full, you trimmed the thread with a small bronze knife that hung from a cord around your neck, and you tucked the end under the last few winds to hold it in place. The pin went back into the shuttle, and the shuttle went back into your hand, and the weaving resumed. The afternoon had grown noticeably longer while you were winding. The sun was lower now, and the light that came through the awning was a deep golden amber that made the dust motes glow like tiny sparks floating in the still air. The spots of light on the ground had stretched into long oval shapes that pointed toward the east, and their edges were soft and blurred. The heat was fading, and the first hint of the evening cool was beginning to make itself felt as a slight change in the texture of the air. It was not cool yet, but it was no longer warm in the same way, and the difference was enough to notice if you were paying attention. You wove for a while longer as the light continued to change. The rhythm of the shuttle and the beater remained the same, and the fabric continued to grow by one thread at a time. The sound of the beater seemed louder now that the afternoon was quieting, and the insects were beginning to stir in the cooler air. The thump echoed softly off the stone walls, and was absorbed by the goat hair awning and the packed earth floor. The sound did not travel far. It stayed within the courtyard, and became part of the courtyard, and anyone passing by on the path above would not have heard it at all. You stopped when the light became too dim to see the individual threads clearly. The shuttle rested on the crossbar, and the beater hung from its cords, and the heddle rods were in their neutral position with all the warp threads hanging straight and even. The fabric hung from the lower beam a little longer than it had been when you sat down. The difference was real, but it was small, and it would be added to again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. The cloth would continue to grow at the same slow pace until it reached the length that was needed, and then it would be cut from the loom, and a new warp would be strung, and the process would begin again. You stood up from the stool, and your legs were stiff from the long sitting. You stretched your arms above your head, and felt the muscles of your shoulders release, and the blood flow back into the places where it had been pressed away by the weight of your body on the wooden seat. The courtyard was quiet, and the awning stirred in the evening breeze, and the moth was gone from the upper beam, having flown away while your attention was on the winding of the pin. The loom stood against the wall, and it would stand there all night and wait for you to return in the morning. The threads would not tangle, and the weights would not shift, and the fabric would not unravel. The loom was patient, and it would wait for as long as was needed. You turned and walked back through the low doorway into the sleeping chamber, where the water jar stood in its corner, and the grinding stone sat on its platform, and the woven rug covered the floor. The day was ending, and the evening tasks were waiting, but there was no hurry. The weaving would be there tomorrow, and the day after, and the season after that. The cloth would grow slowly, and the shuttle would pass back and forth, and the beater would thump against the growing fabric, and the courtyard would remain still, and shaded under its goat hair awning, and the spots of light would shift across the ground, and the moth would return to rest on the upper beam. And nothing would be different from today, and nothing needed to be different. The path that led from the village to the upper slopes was not a path in the way that a road is a path with edges and a surface and a clear direction. It was simply the place where the ground had been walked on more often than the surrounding ground, creating a faint suggestion of a route through the scattered stones and the dry, thorny plants that grew in the cracks of the limestone. The rock here was different from the sandstone of the village proper. It was older and harder, and it had been laid down in layers that tilted upwards toward the east, as if the whole mountain was slowly trying to rise from its foundations. The color of this stone was a pale greyish tan that reflected the midday light with a harsh white glare, and the surface was rough and sharp underfoot because the wind had carved it into small ridges and hollows over the ages. You walked slowly up this faint suggestion of a path, with your sandals making soft scraping sounds against the loose pebbles that covered the underlying rock. The sandals were simple things made from a single piece of thick leather, with cords that wrapped around your ankles and tied at the front. The leather was dark and stiff from exposure to sun and dust, and the occasional wetting from morning dew, and it had moulded itself to the shape of your feet over many months of wearing. The soles were worn smooth in the centre where your weight fell, and the edges were rough where they had rubbed against the stone of the village terraces and the corridors and the cistern steps. The sound of your walking was the only sound on the slope, except for the faint whisper of the wind that moved constantly across the open face of the mountain. The goats were ahead of you somewhere higher up the slope, but you could not see them yet. You knew they were there because you had released them from their stone enclosure beside the village at first light, as you did every morning, and you had watched them file out in their slow, deliberate way and begin the climb to their grazing grounds. The goats knew the way better than any human could know it. They had been walking these slopes since they were kids, following their mothers and learning the locations of the best forage and the safest ledges, and the places where the shade lasted longest in the afternoon. The knowledge was passed down through the herd in a way that required no teaching and no learning, only the simple fact of being a goat on this particular mountain. The first goat you saw was the old female who led the herd. She was standing on a flat outcrop of limestone that jutted out from the slope, like a natural platform, and she was facing away from you toward the vast emptiness of the valley below. Her coat was a mixture of black and white and brown in no particular pattern, and it was long and shaggy because the season for shearing was still some weeks away. The hair moved slightly in the wind that flowed up the face of the cliff, but the goat herself did not move. She stood with all 4 feet planted squarely on the rock, and her head was raised and her ears were still, and her yellow eyes with their horizontal pupils were fixed on something in the far distance that you could not see, and perhaps she could not see either. She was simply looking because looking was what a goat did when it was not eating or resting. You found a place to sit on a nearby boulder that was warm from the sun but not too hot to touch. The boulder was half buried in the slope, and its exposed surface had been weathered into a pattern of small pits and ridges that caught the light in different ways. You settled onto it and let your weight sink into the stone, and you looked out over the same valley that the old female was watching. The view was immense and empty. The valley floor was a long way down, and it stretched from the base of the mountain to the distant range of hills on the far side that were blue with haze and distance. Nothing moved on the valley floor. There were no roads and no vehicles, and no signs of human presence at all, except for the faint line of a dry watercourse that wound through the center of the flat land. The watercourse was pale and empty, and it looked like a scar that had healed long ago and left only a memory of its former shape. The other goats were scattered across the slope above and below the old female. They were spread out in a loose group that had no particular shape, because the shape was determined by the location of the edible plants and the comfortable resting spots and the individual preferences of each animal. Some of the goats were standing, and some were lying down, and some were walking slowly from one thorny bush to another, with the patient, aimless gait that goats have when there is no urgency about anything. The sound of their movement was a soft, intermittent clatter of small hooves on loose stone, and the occasional rustle of dry leaves as a mouth closed around a branch and pulled it free. A young goat with pale cream-colored hair and small buds of horns just beginning to show through the fuzz on its head was investigating a low acacia bush that grew from a crack in the limestone. The bush was old and gnarled, and its branches were covered with long white thorns that protected the tiny grayish-green leaves. The young goat approached the bush with its head turned slightly to the side and its lips already moving in anticipation of the leaves. It reached past the thorns with a precision that seemed careless but was in fact the result of many small lessons learned from its mother and from the sharp surprises of earlier attempts. Its tongue curled around a cluster of leaves and drew them into its mouth, and its jaws began the slow, sideways grinding motion that goats use to break down the tough, dry vegetation of these slopes. The sound of the chewing was a soft, rhythmic crunching that blended with the whisper of the wind and the distant buzz of some unseen insect. The young goat chewed for a long time on that single mouthful of leaves. The vegetation on these high slopes was sparse and tough, and it required patience to extract whatever nourishment it contained. The goat's jaw moved in a slow circle, pausing occasionally as if it was considering the flavor or the texture, or perhaps nothing at all. When the mouthful was finally reduced to a soft pulp, the goat swallowed, and the motion of its throat was visible as a small ripple passing down the length of its neck. Then it reached past the thorns again and took another small cluster of leaves, and the process repeated exactly as before. Further up the slope, another goat had found a patch of dry grass growing in a shallow depression where a little extra moisture collected during the rare rains. The grass was pale brown and brittle, and it crunched loudly when the goat bit into it. The goat was a medium-sized female with a dark brown coat and one ear that flopped sideways while the other stood upright. She moved through the patch of grass with her head down and her muzzle close to the ground, and she took small, precise bites that left the roots undisturbed. The grass would grow again when the rains returned, and the goat seemed to know this in some deep way that had nothing to do with thought. She ate what she needed and left the rest and moved on to the next patch a few steps away. The sound of a pebble dislodged by a hoof drew your attention to a steep section of the slope where a large male goat was picking his way across a scree field. The scree was a slope of loose angular stones that had broken away from the cliff face above and tumbled down over centuries to form an unstable surface that shifted under any weight. The male goat walked across this surface with a slow, deliberate care, placing each hoof exactly on a stone that would bear his weight without sliding. His legs were thin and strong, and the joints of his knees and ankles moved with a precision that made the difficult terrain look easy. A stone shifted under his hind foot and tumbled a short distance down the slope before lodging against another stone and coming to rest. The sound of the stone's movement was a sharp clack, followed by a rattle and then silence. The goat did not look back at the stone. He continued across the scree at the same unhurried pace and soon reached a patch of solid rock on the far side, where he stopped and stood still and looked out over the valley with the same distant gaze as the old female. The sun was high now, and the heat was pressing down on the slope with a weight that you could feel on your shoulders and the top of your head. The light was so bright that it bleached the color from everything and made the pale limestone seem almost white. The shadows were short and sharp, and they lay directly beneath each stone and each bush and each goat. The shadow of the old female on her outcrop was a compact, dark shape that clung to the rock beneath her as if trying to escape the heat by pressing itself into the stone. The shadow did not move because the goat did not move, and the sun was too high for the shadow to lengthen or shift in any noticeable way. You closed your eyes against the brightness and let the warmth settle into your skin. The rock beneath you was hot now, but not unpleasantly so, and the heat travelled up through your body and loosened the muscles of your back and your neck. The sounds of the slope continued around you without demanding your attention. The crunch of leaves being chewed and the occasional clatter of a displaced stone and the soft padding of hooves on solid rock. The sounds were all variations of the same quiet theme, the theme of small lives moving slowly through a large landscape without hurry or purpose beyond the simple continuation of the day. The young goat with the pale cream coat had finished with the acacia bush and was now standing in the shade of a larger boulder a short distance up the slope. The shade was narrow, and it covered only the goat's head and shoulders, while its hindquarters remained in the full sun. The goat did not seem to mind this partial shade. It stood with its eyes half closed and its lower jaw moving in the slow, rhythmic motion of rumination. The cud had come up from its stomach, and it was chewing it again with the same patient circular motion that it had used for the fresh leaves. The process of rumination was the goat's true work, and it occupied more hours of the day than any other activity. The goat would chew and swallow and wait, and then another portion of cud would rise and the chewing would resume. The cycle was endless, and it required no attention, and it filled the long hot hours with a quiet occupation that was enough. The old female on her outcrop had not moved in all the time you had been sitting there. Her feet were still planted in the same positions, and her head was still raised, and her gaze was still fixed on the distant blue hills across the valley. A faint breeze ruffled the long hair on her back, and the hair rose and fell in a slow wave that travelled from her shoulders to her tail. The movement was the only sign that she was a living creature, and not a carving placed on the outcrop by some ancient hand. She was the center of the herd, and her stillness seemed to hold the other goats in place around her. As long as she remained on the outcrop, the herd would remain scattered across this section of the slope, grazing and resting and chewing their cud in the deep silence of the afternoon. A large dark bird appeared high overhead, riding a thermal of warm air that rose from the valley floor. The bird was too far away to identify, but its shape was the shape of a bird that spends its days circling and watching and waiting. It did not flap its wings. It simply held them outstretched and let the rising air carry it in slow spirals that grew wider and wider as it gained altitude. Its shadow passed over the slope for a moment, a swift dark shape that raced across the pale stone and the scattered goats and was gone before anyone could look up to see what had caused it. The goats did not react to the shadow. They had seen such shadows every day of their lives, and they knew without thinking that the bird far above was no threat to them. The shadow was just another passing thing in a world full of passing things. The heat of the afternoon had reached its peak, and the air seemed to thicken and grow heavy with the weight of the sun. The insects that had been buzzing earlier had fallen silent, and even the wind had died away to nothing. The slope was suspended in a stillness that felt almost solid, as if the light itself had become a substance that filled the spaces between the stones and the thorny bushes and the motionless goats. You opened your eyes, and the brightness was painful for a moment, until your pupils adjusted. The scene before you was exactly the same as it had been when you closed your eyes. The old female on her outcrop, and the young goat in its partial shade, and the male goat on the far side of the scree field. Nothing had moved, and nothing had changed, and the afternoon continued to pass in the same slow measure that it had been passing since the sun rose. A small sound drew your attention to a spot just below your boulder, where a kid was lying in the shade of a flat rock. The kid was very young, perhaps only a few weeks old, and its coat was a soft pale brown that blended almost perfectly with the color of the dusty ground. It was lying with its legs folded beneath it, and its head resting on the warm stone, and its eyes were closed. Its sides rose and fell with a quick, shallow rhythm that was different from the slow, deep breathing of the adult goats. The kid was sleeping the deep, boneless sleep of the very young, and its small body was completely relaxed and trusting. Its mother was somewhere nearby, grazing on a patch of dry vegetation, and she would return to the kid when she was ready. For now the kid slept on in its patch of shade, and the afternoon passed over it without disturbance. The sun had begun its slow descent toward the western rim of the valley. The change was subtle at first, only a slight softening of the harsh white light into something that held the faintest hint of gold. The shadows began to lengthen, stretching out from the bases of the stones and the bushes and the goats. The shadow of the old female on her outcrop grew longer and began to creep down the face of the rock toward the slope below. The goat herself remained motionless, but her shadow was moving with the sun, marking the passage of the afternoon in a way that was visible if you watched carefully. The young goat in the partial shade had finished chewing its cud and was now lying down in the same spot where it had been standing. It folded its legs in the complicated way that goats fold their legs, lowering its front end first and then tucking its hindquarters underneath itself. It settled onto the warm stone with a soft grunt and rested its chin on the ground and closed its eyes. Within moments its breathing had slowed and deepened, and it had joined the kid in the deep sleep of the afternoon. The two goats slept on in their separate patches of shade, and the slope was quiet around them. You sat on the warm boulder and watched the shadows lengthen and the light soften, and the goats continue their slow, aimless existence on the hillside. The afternoon was long, and it would continue to be long for some time yet. The goats would graze and rest and chew their cud and sleep, and then they would wake and graze again. The old female would remain on her outcrop until she decided it was time to move to a different spot. The male goat would cross back over the scree field when the evening cool began to settle in. The kid would wake and find its mother and nurse for a while, and then follow her to a new patch of shade. The cycle would continue as it had continued for all the days before this day, and as it would continue for all the days after. The sound of a distant bleat floated across the slope from somewhere higher up the mountain. It was a single call without urgency or distress, only the sound of one goat letting the others know where it was. The bleat hung in the still air for a moment, and then faded, and the silence returned. No other goat answered the call because no answer was needed. The herd knew where each member was without needing to be told. They had been together on this slope since morning, and they would be together when they returned to the stone enclosure in the evening. The bleat was simply a sound that goats make, the way the wind makes a sound when it passes through the thorns, and the way the stones make a sound when a hoof dislodges them. It was part of the fabric of the afternoon, and it meant nothing beyond itself. The sun touched the rim of the western hills, and the light turned a deep golden amber that made the pale limestone glow with a warmth that it had not possessed all day. The shadows were long, now stretching far across the slope and joining together into pools of darkness that filled the hollows between the stones. The old female on her outcrop finally moved. She turned her head slowly and looked back over her shoulder at the scattered members of her herd. Then she stepped down from the outcrop with a single careful motion and began to walk slowly across the slope toward a new spot that had caught her attention. The other goats noticed her movement, and some of them rose to their feet and began to drift in the same general direction. The herd was not moving as a group, but as a collection of individuals who happened to be going the same way at the same time. You stood up from the boulder and stretched your legs, which had grown stiff from the long sitting. The rock was still warm under your feet, and the warmth was pleasant, now that the air was beginning to cool. You turned and began the slow walk back down the faint path toward the village. The goats would follow in their own time. When the light faded enough to signal the end of the grazing day, they would find their way back to the stone enclosure and settle in for the night, and tomorrow they would climb the slope again and find new patches of dry grass and new thorny bushes and new spots of shade. The kid would grow a little larger, and the young goat would learn a little more about where the best leaves grew. The old female would stand on her outcrop and watch the valley, and nothing would change in any way that mattered. The goats would continue to be goats on the high slopes above Petra, and the afternoons would continue to pass in the same deep silence and the same slow measure that they had always passed. The steps began at the edge of the village, where the last of the carved dwellings gave way to the open face of the mountain. They were not steps in the way that a staircase is, steps with regular rises and even treads and a clear beginning and end. They were simply places where the living rock had been cut away to create a series of ledges that a human foot could find and use to climb higher. The builders had worked with the natural contours of the sandstone, following the seams and the softer layers where the chisel bit more easily into the grain. The result was a path that wandered and turned and sometimes doubled back on itself as it found the most patient way up the steep face of the cliff. You placed your foot on the first of these ledges and felt the familiar coolness of the stone through the thin leather of your sandal. The step was worn smooth in the center, where the traffic of centuries had passed, and the edges were still rough where the chisel marks had never been softened by the touch of feet. The groove in the center was exactly the width of a human foot, and it had been shaped by all the feet that had come before yours over so many generations that no one could count them. The stone had given way to this repeated pressure, not by breaking or crumbling, but by slowly polishing itself into a shape that welcomed the next foot and the next and the next. The climb was slow from the first moment. There was no way to hurry on these steps because the rises were uneven, and some were high enough to require a deliberate lift of the knee, and others were so shallow that they were almost level ground. The rhythm of the climb was not a steady beat, but a series of pauses and adjustments as your body found its balance on each new ledge before committing to the next. Your hand reached out to touch the wall beside the steps, and the stone was warm from the afternoon sun on this outward-facing section of the path. The warmth was a comfort and a guide, and your fingers trailed along the surface, feeling the subtle changes in texture where the grain of the sandstone shifted from fine to coarse and back again. The handrail groove was the most remarkable feature of this path. It was a deep, smooth channel worn into the vertical face of the rock at just the right height for a human hand to grip while climbing. The groove had not been carved intentionally by the builders. It had been created by the accumulated touch of countless hands over countless years, each one reaching out to steady itself on the steepest sections and each one removing a microscopic layer of stone with the friction of skin and sweat and the fine dust that always coated everything in this dry place. The groove was as smooth as polished wood, and it fit the curve of curled fingers with a precision that no craftsman could have achieved by design. It was a record of human passage written not in words but in the slow erosion of sandstone by the simple act of climbing. You stopped at a wider ledge where the path made a sharp turn to the left around a protruding buttress of rock. This was one of the places where the climbers before you had paused to rest, and the evidence of their resting was visible in the way the stone had been worn into a shallow seat against the inner wall. You sat in this seat and felt the shape of it accommodate your body with the same quiet familiarity as the groove in the cistern corridor. The stone was cool here because this section of the path was shaded by the overhang of the cliff above, and the sun had not touched it since early morning. The coolness seeped through your clothing and into the muscles of your back and your legs, and you rested in the way that a person rests when there is no hurry and no destination that demands arrival by any particular time. The view from this resting spot was a narrow slice of the valley below, framed by the walls of the cleft through which the path climbed. The slice showed a section of the pale floor of the Arava, with the darker line of the dry watercourse winding through it, and the distant hills beyond that were blue with the haze of late afternoon. Nothing moved in the view. There were no birds crossing the slice of sky, and no dust rising from the valley floor, and no shadows shifting, except the imperceptible lengthening of the shadows cast by the mountains themselves. The world outside the cleft was still and silent, and it seemed to be waiting for something that would never arrive. You rose from the stone seat and continued upward. The path grew steeper here, and the steps became more widely spaced, requiring a longer reach of the leg and a firmer grip on the handrail groove. Your breathing deepened to match the effort, and the sound of your breath was the only sound in the narrow cleft. The walls closed in on either side, and the sky above was reduced to a ribbon of pale blue that twisted and turned with the path. The light in the cleft was dim and indirect, bouncing from wall to wall until it reached you as a soft, diffuse glow that had no source you could point to. The sandstone here was a deeper shade of rose than the stone lower down, and it was striped with bands of darker red and pale yellow, where different minerals had been deposited during the long, slow formation of the rock. The feel of the steps changed as you climbed higher. The lower steps had been worn by the daily traffic of the villagers going about their ordinary business. The higher steps were worn differently because fewer people made this climb, and those who did were moving with a different purpose or with no purpose at all beyond the simple act of ascending. The wear here was deeper but narrower, more concentrated in the exact center of each tread, where the weight of a single file of climbers had pressed down over the centuries. The edges of the steps were sharper, and the chisel marks were still visible in the corners where no foot had ever landed. The path felt older here, or perhaps it was only that the passage of time was more visible when it was not obscured by the daily erasure of constant use. A small lizard clung to the wall beside the path, its body pressed flat against the warm stone. Its color was almost exactly the color of the sandstone, a pale brownish gray with darker speckles that matched the grain of the rock. It remained perfectly still as you passed, and its black eye watched you without blinking and without any sign of concern. The lizard had seen climbers on this path every day of its life, and it knew that the climbers were not interested in lizards. It would remain on its patch of warm stone until the sun moved away, and then it would find another patch and another, and its life would continue in the same slow rhythm as the life of the stone itself. The path emerged from the narrow cleft onto a broader section of the mountainside, where the slope was less severe, and the steps gave way to a sloping ramp of smooth rock. The ramp had been worn by water rather than by feet, because this was a place where the rare rains funneled down from the plateau above and scoured the surface clean. The stone here was slick and polished, and it reflected the pale sky with a faint gleam that hurt the eyes if you looked at it directly. You walked carefully across this section with your arms held slightly out for balance and your feet testing each placement before committing your weight. The ramp sloped upward at a steady angle, and it led to a narrow saddle between two peaks where the path resumed its stair-step pattern. The wind found you at the saddle. It was not a gust or a breeze, but a constant pressure that flowed through the gap between the peaks with the steady persistence of water flowing through a channel. The wind was warm because it had traveled across the baking surface of the plateau all afternoon, but it carried a dryness that made your skin feel tight and your eyes want to blink more often. The sound of the wind was a low, continuous hum that filled your ears and erased all other sounds. You could no longer hear your own footsteps or your own breathing. There was only the wind and the pressure of the wind and the way it pushed against your body with a force that was not strong enough to move you, but was strong enough to remind you that you were a small thing standing in a large place. The high place was visible now above you, a flat platform of rock that projected from the summit like a natural altar. The platform was not large, perhaps 20 paces across, and it was surrounded on three sides by a sheer drop to the valley floor far below. The builders had enhanced the natural shape of the summit by cutting away the loose stone and leveling the surface and carving a series of shallow basins and channels that had some purpose that no one now remembered. The purpose did not matter. What mattered was the platform itself and the way it sat at the highest point of the mountain, with nothing above it but the sky and nothing around it but the empty air. You climbed the final steps and stepped onto the platform. The stone underfoot was different here. It was harder and darker, with a bluish-grey tint that came from the intense heat of the sun over ages. The surface was covered with a fine scatter of small stones and dust that the wind had not been able to remove, because the wind here was a constant sweeping force that kept everything in motion. The dust moved in small spirals across the platform, tracing patterns that formed and dissolved in the space of a breath. The spirals rose and fell and rose again, and they seemed to be searching for something that was not there. The view from the summit was not a view in the way that a painting is a view with a frame and a composition and a focal point. It was simply the absence of obstruction in all directions. The valley floor lay below you at a distance that was hard to judge because there was nothing to measure it against. It was a flat, hazy expanse of pale brown and grey that stretched to the horizon in all directions except where the mountains rose behind you. The distant hills on the far side of the valley were a soft blue-grey that merged with the color of the sky at the horizon so that you could not tell where the land ended and the air began. The haze was a permanent feature of this place, a mixture of fine dust and the evaporation of what little moisture remained in the soil. It softened every edge and muted every color until the world looked like a drawing that had been left in the sun too long. You walked to the edge of the platform and sat down with your legs hanging over the drop. The stone was warm from the sun, but the wind was constant, and it pulled the heat away from your skin as fast as the stone could give it. The sensation was of being both warm and cool at the same time, a balance that made it easy to remain still for a long while. The drop below your feet was sheer, and it fell away in a series of ledges and crevices to the talus slope, far below. The talus was a steep fan of broken stone that had accumulated at the base of the cliff over the millennia, and it looked like a frozen waterfall of grey and brown rubble. Nothing grew on the talus and nothing moved, and it was as still as the rest of the valley. The wind made a sound against the edge of the platform, a low rushing note that varied slightly in pitch as the force of the wind fluctuated. The sound was not unpleasant. It was the sound of air moving past a solid obstacle, and it was as natural as the sound of water moving past a stone in a stream. The sound filled your ears and your mind, and it left no room for thoughts. You sat on the edge of the platform and listened to the wind and watched the haze shift slowly over the valley floor, and you felt the warmth of the stone and the coolness of the moving air. The combination was a kind of stillness that was different from the stillness of the shaded courtyard or the dark cistern. It was the stillness of being so high and so exposed that the world below seemed to belong to a different order of existence. A small brown bird appeared from somewhere below the platform and hovered in the wind for a moment before darting away to the shelter of a crevice. The bird was a swift or a swallow, some kind of creature that spent its life in the air and only touched the stone to rest. Its movement was quick and precise, and it seemed to find the wind effortless even as you felt the pressure of it against your own body. The bird disappeared into the crevice and did not emerge again, and the sky was empty once more. The sun was lower now, and the light had taken on the deep golden amber quality that came in the late afternoon. The haze over the valley caught this light and glowed with a soft diffuse radiance that made the whole expanse look like a body of still water reflecting the sky. The illusion was strong enough that you could almost believe the valley was flooded, and that the distant hills were islands rising from a golden sea. But the water was not water, and the hills were not islands, and the illusion would fade as the sun sank lower and the colors shifted toward the cooler tones of evening. You remained on the edge of the platform as the light changed and the wind continued its constant pressure. The climb had been slow and the rest was welcome, and there was no reason to descend until the light began to fail. The village below was invisible from this angle, hidden by the folds of the mountain and the overhanging cliffs. You could not see the dwellings or the courtyard awnings or the goats on their slopes. You could see only the vast empty valley and the distant hills and the sky that was beginning to show the first faint colors of sunset along the western rim. The wind shifted slightly, and for a moment it brought a scent that was different from the dry dust of the plateau. It was a faint cool smell that came from the deep shadows of the canyons where the sun never reached. The smell was of damp stone and the memory of water that had passed through those shadows long ago. It was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the familiar dryness of the high air. But the moment lingered in your awareness, a reminder that the mountain was not only the sun-baked surface you could see, but also the deep hidden places where the coolness never left. You stood up from the edge of the platform and your legs were stiff from the sitting and the climb. You turned away from the view and faced the path that led back down into the mountain. The steps waited below the first of them, just visible at the edge of the platform where the rock dropped away. The descent would be slower than the climb because the downward steps required more care, and the light was fading and the shadows were growing longer in the clefts and crevices. But there was no hurry. The village would be there when you arrived, and the evening tasks would be waiting, and the night would come in its own time. You placed your foot on the first descending step, and your hand found the smooth groove of the handrail. The stone was cooler now that the sun had left this face of the mountain, and the coolness was a comfort to your palm. You began the slow descent into the cleft, and the sound of the wind faded behind you, replaced by the soft scrape of your sandals on the worn stone. The ribbon of sky above narrowed as you descended, and the light grew dimmer, and the walls closed in. The steps passed under your feet one after another, each one the same as the one before and the one after. The rhythm of the descent was slow and steady, and it required no thought. Your body knew the way, and your mind was free to drift back to the view from the summit and the constant pressure of the wind and the golden haze over the valley floor. The path turned and turned again, and the village was still below you, hidden in the folds of the mountain. The descent continued, and the light continued to fade, and the coolness of the stone deepened. The handrail groove guided your hand, and the worn centers of the steps guided your feet. You moved through the dim cleft with the same patient pace as the water that had carved these channels in the rock over ages beyond counting. The climb was over, and the summit was behind you, and the memory of the high place would remain as a quiet presence in the back of your mind, a place of wind and light and endless stillness that you could return to whenever you chose to make the slow ascent again. The light in the sleeping chamber had faded to a deep amber that pooled in the corners and left the center of the room in a soft shadow that seemed to breathe with the slow exhalation of the cooling stone. The sun had dropped behind the western rim of the valley, and the window opening now faced a sky that was still bright but no longer direct. The quality of the light was different from any other time of day. It was a light that seemed to come from the air itself rather than from any single source, and it filled the chamber with a warmth that had no heat, only the memory of heat held in the sandstone and the woven wool and the warm palm fronds of the sleeping mat. You knelt on the packed earth floor before the hearth niche that had been carved into the back wall of the chamber. The niche was a simple arched opening about the height of a seated person's chest, and its interior was blackened by the smoke of countless fires that had burned there over the years. The blackening was not a uniform coating, but a deep layered accumulation that was thicker in some places and thinner in others, depending on the path that the smoke preferred to take as it rose toward the small vent hole that had been drilled through the stone ceiling. The vent hole was invisible in the darkness above, but you knew it was there because the smoke always found it, and because a faint circle of lighter stone marked its location on the ceiling if you looked carefully in the full light of day. The hearth floor was of flat stone that had been fitted into the base of the niche, and its surface was covered with a fine layer of pale ash from the morning fire. You swept this ash to the sides with a small bundle of twigs tied together at one end, leaving a clean space in the center where the new fire would be laid. The ash was soft and weightless, and it rose in a small cloud as you swept it, disturbing the still air of the chamber and sending a faint dry scent into your nose. The scent was the smell of old fires of wood that had burned completely and left nothing behind but this fine grey powder that was almost as insubstantial as the air itself. The fuel for the evening fire waited in a shallow basket beside the hearth. The basket contained a mixture of materials, each one chosen for a specific purpose, in the slow process of building and maintaining a flame that would last through the preparation of the evening meal and into the first hours of the night. There were dry juniper twigs, no thicker than your smallest finger, their bark peeling in thin, papery strips that curled away from the pale wood beneath. There were several flat cakes of dried goat dung mixed with chopped straw that had been shaped by hand and left in the sun until they were hard and light and almost odorless. And there were a few larger pieces of acacia wood cut from a dead branch that had been found on the hillside and carried down to the village to dry in the shade of the courtyard. For just such an evening as this, you selected 3 of the juniper twigs and arranged them on the clean stone in a small triangle, with their tips touching at the center and their bases spread wide. The arrangement was ancient, and you did it without thinking because your hands had learned the pattern from watching other hands when you were young, and because the pattern worked. The twigs were dry and brittle, and they snapped with a clean, sharp sound if you bent them too far, but you handled them gently and they held their shape. On top of the twig triangle, you placed a small handful of the driest dung cakes, crumbled between your fingers into a loose pile of dark, fibrous fragments that would catch the flame from the twigs and hold it long enough for the larger fuel to ignite. The tinder was a scrap of linen cloth that had been torn from a worn-out garment and left to dry in the sun until it was as light and fragile as a dead leaf. You teased the fibers apart with your fingernails until they formed a soft, fluffy mass that would take a spark with the slightest encouragement. This mass you tucked into the center of the twig triangle, where it sat like a small, pale nest, waiting for the fire to be born. The fire starter was a simple thing. A curved piece of hardwood with a notch cut into one end and a straight stick of softer wood that fit into the notch. A leather cord was wrapped around the straight stick, and the ends of the cord were tied to a small bow made from a flexible branch. You set the notched piece on the stone beside the hearth and fitted the straight stick into the notch and looped a bowstring around the stick. Then you placed a small flat piece of stone on top of the stick to hold it steady, and you began to move the bow back and forth with a slow, steady rhythm. The stick rotated against the notch, and the friction generated a fine, dark dust that accumulated in a small pile at the edge of the wood. The dust began to smoke after a few moments of this motion, and you increased the speed of the bow slightly until a tiny red ember appeared in the heart of the dust pile. You transferred the ember to the linen tinder with a careful motion that required both hands and the held breath. The tinder caught the ember, and a thin curl of smoke rose from its center. You lifted the tinder to your lips and blew gently on the ember with a soft, steady breath that was more like a sigh than a blow. The ember glowed brighter, and the smoke thickened, and then with a sound that was too soft to hear, but somehow present in the air, a small flame appeared at the edge of the linen fibers. The flame was pale yellow and almost transparent at its base, and it flickered with the uncertainty of a new thing that was not yet sure it would survive. You placed the burning tinder into the nest of twigs and watched as the flame reached out and touched the dried juniper bark. The bark curled away from the heat and then caught with a soft crackling sound that was the first voice of the new fire. The flame grew taller and stronger, and its color deepened to a warm orange that illuminated the interior of the hearth niche and sent shadows dancing across the blackened walls. The juniper twigs burned with a clear, bright flame that made very little smoke because the wood was so dry and so dense. The heat of the fire began to radiate outward from the hearth, and you could feel it on your face and your hands and the front of your tunic. You added more twigs to the fire one at a time, placing them carefully so that they would catch without smothering the flame. The fire grew, and the crackling sound became a soft, steady murmur that filled the chamber and pushed back against the silence of the evening. The light from the flames reached across the floor and touched the edge of the rug, and the base of the water jar and the lower curve of the grinding stone on its platform. The room that had been dim and shadowed was now filled with a warm living light that moved and shifted with every small change in the fire. The dung cakes came next. You placed 2 of the flat dried cakes on top of the burning twigs, and watched as the edges began to darken and then to glow with a deep red that spread slowly inward. The dung did not burn with a flame like the wood. It smoldered and glowed and produced a steady heat that was different from the bright heat of the twigs. The heat from the dung was deeper and more persistent, and it would last far longer than the quick flame of the juniper. The smell of the burning dung was faint and not unpleasant. A dry, earthy scent that reminded you of the hillside in the full sun and the goats that had provided the material. The scent blended with the sharper fragrance of the juniper smoke, and the combination was the smell of home and evening and the slow closing of the day. The smoke from the fire rose in a thin ribbon that twisted and curled as it found its way toward the vent hole in the ceiling. The ribbon was pale grey against the darkness above, and it moved with a languid grace that seemed almost deliberate, as if the smoke was choosing its path moment by moment. It rose straight for a handspan, and then curved to the left, and then straightened again, and then spread into a thin sheet that caught the light from the flames and glowed with a soft silver color before it passed into the vent and disappeared. The smoke was the breath of the fire, and it carried with it the scents of the burning wood, and the smouldering dung, and the faint sweetness of the juniper resin. It rose and vanished, and new smoke took its place, and the ribbon continued without end, a continuous stream of pale grey flowing upward into the darkness. The cooking stone was a flat, smooth piece of sandstone that had been selected from the hillside for its ability to hold heat without cracking. It rested on 2 smaller stones at the edge of the hearth where the heat was strong but not directly in the flames. You had placed the stone there when you first lit the fire, and it had been warming slowly while the flames grew. Now it was hot enough that a drop of water flicked from your fingertips would dance and sizzle and disappear in a brief puff of steam. The stone was ready. The dough had been mixed earlier in the afternoon. From the flour you had ground at midday, and water from the jar, and a small pinch of salt from the clay pot on the ledge. It had rested in a covered bowl in the coolest corner of the chamber, and it had risen slightly from the wild yeast that lived in the air and on the surfaces of the room. The dough was soft and slightly sticky, and it smelled of grain and fermentation, and the faint mineral tang of the water from the deep cistern. You divided the dough into small portions and flattened each one between your palms into a thin round disc about the width of your outstretched hand. The first disc you laid on the hot stone and it began to cook immediately. The surface of the dough bubbled and puffed, and the edges curled upward slightly as the moisture inside turned to steam. The smell of baking bread joined the smells of the fire and the dung and the juniper, and the combination was the smell of evening and warmth, and the simple fact of being alive in this place at this moment. You watched the bread cook, and turned it once with a flat wooden paddle when the bottom was spotted with brown. The second side cooked more quickly than the first, and soon the flatbread was done, and you lifted it from the stone and placed it in a shallow basket lined with a clean cloth. The process repeated with each disc of dough. You shaped and flattened and placed on the stone, and watched and turned and lifted. The basket filled slowly with a stack of warm flatbreads that steamed gently in the cooling air of the chamber. The fire continued to burn, and the dung cakes glowed with their steady deep red heat, and the smoke continued its slow curl upward into the darkness. The rhythm of the baking was different from the rhythm of the grinding or the weaving. It was a rhythm that required attention because the bread would burn if left too long. But it was also a rhythm that allowed the mind to drift, because the signs of readiness were clear and familiar. The bubbles on the surface, and the browning of the edges, and the way the bread released from the stone when it was done. These signs spoke a language that your hands understood without translation. The last disc of dough went onto the stone, and you added another dung cake to the fire to keep the heat steady. The flames had died down now, and the hearth was filled with a bed of glowing embers that cast a deep red light across the floor. The embers shifted occasionally with a soft rustling sound as the burned material collapsed into ash, and the remaining fuel settled into a new arrangement. The sound was quiet and irregular, and it was the kind of sound that you only noticed when you stopped paying attention to everything else. The smoke continued to rise and curl and vanish. It had been rising and curling and vanishing since the first spark caught the linen tinder, and it would continue to do so until the last ember faded to black. The smoke was a bridge between the fire and the sky, between the warmth of the hearth and the cool darkness of the night outside. It carried the breath of the dwelling upward and released it into the vast empty air above the village, where it dispersed and became nothing and was forgotten. The smoke was a record of the fire, but it was a record that erased itself moment by moment, leaving no trace except the thin layer of soot that accumulated on the ceiling stone over years and decades and generations. The last flatbread came off the stone and joined the others in the basket. You moved the cooking stone to the side of the hearth with the wooden paddle and let it begin its slow cooling. The stone would be warm for a long time, radiating its stored heat into the chamber through the first hours of the night. You placed a final dung cake on the embers and watched as its edges caught the glow and began the slow transformation into heat and light and the faint earthy scent that was now as familiar as your own breath. The evening meal was simple. A piece of the warm flatbread torn from the stack, and a small bowl of olive oil from the clay jar in the corner, and a few dried figs from the basket on the ledge. The oil was golden and thick, and it smelled of the distant groves where the olives had been pressed. The figs were dark and wrinkled, and their sweetness was concentrated by the sun and the dry air into something that was almost like honey. You ate slowly without hurry because the night was long and there was nothing that needed to be done after the meal except to sit and watch the embers and let the warmth of the fire soak into your bones. The fire had settled into a deep, steady glow. The flames were gone, and the hearth was a bed of red and orange embers that pulsed faintly with a rhythm that matched the slow movement of the air through the chamber. The embers were the heart of the evening, the center around which the rest of the room arranged itself. The water jar and the grinding stone and the woven rug and the sleeping platform all seemed to lean slightly toward the hearth, as if drawn by the warmth and the light. You sat on the low stool that had been pulled close to the fire, and you watched the embers and listened to their soft rustling and felt the heat on your face and your hands. The smoke had thinned to a faint wisp that was barely visible against the darkness of the ceiling. It rose from the embers in a pale thread that twisted once and then straightened and then disappeared. The thread was so fine that it seemed more like a heat shimmer than actual smoke, a visible trembling in the air above the hearth. It rose and vanished and rose again, and the cycle continued without end, as the embers slowly consumed themselves and the dung cake turned to ash. The light from the embers painted the chamber in shades of deep red and soft orange and warm brown. The shadows were long and soft-edged, and they moved slowly as the embers shifted and settled. The water jar in the corner caught the glow, and its terracotta surface seemed to pulse with a warmth that came from within. The grinding stone on its platform was a dark shape against the wall, but its upper surface reflected a faint gleam of red from the fire. The woven rug on the floor was a field of shifting shadows and warm light, and the pattern that had faded long ago seemed to reappear in the firelight as a ghost of its former self. Your eyes grew heavy as you sat by the fire. The warmth and the stillness and the soft rustling of the embers combined into a single sensation that was the sensation of the evening itself. The day was over, and the tasks were done, and the night was spreading across the valley outside. The window opening showed a square of deep blue sky that was darkening toward black, and a single bright star had appeared in the center of the square. The star was steady and unwinking, and it seemed to be watching the chamber with the same patient stillness as the water jar and the grinding stone. The last of the dung cake crumbled into ash, and the bed of embers settled lower in the hearth. The glow was softer now, and the heat was less intense, but the warmth remained in the stone and in the air and in your body. You would add no more fuel to the fire tonight. The embers would fade slowly through the first hours of darkness, and by the deep night the hearth would be cold and the chamber would be cool, and the blanket on the sleeping platform would be welcome. That was the rhythm of the evening fire. It burned while it was needed, and then it faded, and the night took over. You rose from the stool and moved to the sleeping platform. The palm frond mat rustled softly as you settled onto it, and the wool blanket was rough and warm against your skin. The firelight reached across the floor and touched the edge of the platform, and your face was illuminated by a soft red glow that would fade as the embers faded. You lay on your side with your head on the curved wooden rest and your eyes facing the hearth. The embers glowed and pulsed, and the thin wisp of smoke rose and curled and vanished. The star in the window watched, and the night deepened, and the warmth of the fire slowly gave way to the coolness of the stone. The smoke continued to rise long after you closed your eyes. It rose through the vent hole and into the night air above the village, where it mingled with the smoke from other hearths and the cool breath of the mountain and the vast silence of the valley. It dispersed and faded and became part of the darkness, and in the chamber below the embers grew dimmer and the glow softened and the warmth retreated into the stone. The fire was ending, and the night was beginning, and the long, slow rhythm of the village continued without interruption into the stillness of the hours before dawn. The storage jar had been waiting on the smooth rock shelf for longer than anyone in the village could remember. It was not the only jar on the shelf, because there were others of various sizes and shapes and conditions arranged in a loose row against the low stone wall that marked the edge of the terrace. But this particular jar was the largest of them all, standing nearly to the height of a person's waist, with a wide belly that swelled outward from a narrow base and then tapered again to a thick, rolled rim. The clay of the jar was a warm reddish-brown that had darkened over the years from exposure to sun and dust and the oils of countless hands. The surface was covered with a fine network of crackling lines where the outer slip had shrunk and split during the original firing in some kiln down in the valley long ago. The lines did not weaken the jar, they were simply the marks of age, and they gave the surface a texture that caught the light in interesting ways when the sun was low. The crack that needed attention ran vertically down one side of the jar from just below the shoulder to a point about halfway to the base. It was a thin crack, no wider than a thread of wool, and it had probably been there for many seasons without causing any trouble. But the dry air of the high village had slowly drawn moisture from the clay, and the crack had widened by a tiny amount each year, until it was now just large enough that a seep of water would appear on the outside of the jar when it was filled to the brim. The seep was not a leak in the way that a broken pot leaks with a stream of water running onto the floor. It was a darkening of the clay, a patch of dampness that spread slowly outward from the crack and evaporated almost as quickly as it appeared. The jar still held water well enough for ordinary use, but the season of repairs had arrived, and the crack would be sealed before it grew any wider. You sat on the rock shelf beside the jar with your legs crossed and your back resting against the low stone wall. The shelf was a natural outcrop of sandstone that had been leveled by the original builders to create a workspace overlooking the village and the valley beyond. The stone here was warm from the afternoon sun, but not hot because a large overhang of rock above provided shade for most of the day. The position was comfortable and familiar, and it offered a view of the terraced slopes below and the distant blue hills on the far side of the Arava. The view was the same view that you had seen from every other vantage point in the village, but it was framed differently from this shelf, with a large boulder on the left and a twisted acacia tree on the right that created a natural border around the scene. The materials for the repair were laid out on a flat stone beside your knee. There was a lump of raw bitumen that had been collected from a seep somewhere in the valley many years ago and had been stored in a small clay pot ever since. The bitumen was black and hard, and it gleamed with a dull luster in the shaded light. There was a small pile of crushed limestone that had been ground to a fine powder between two stones earlier in the day, and the powder was a pale greyish-white that contrasted sharply with the dark bitumen. There was a smooth river stone that served as a grinding and mixing tool, and there was a thin piece of shaped bone that would be used to work the mixture into the crack, and there was a small clay bowl of water from the cistern for moistening the surface and cleaning the tools. You began by examining the crack more closely, running the tip of your finger along its length from top to bottom. The edges of the crack were sharp, but not crumbly, and the clay on either side was sound. This was a good crack if a crack could be called good. It was clean and straight, and it had not branched into smaller fissures that would be difficult to seal. The jar had been made by a skilled potter who had understood the clay of this region and had fired it to exactly the right temperature to achieve strength without brittleness. The crack was the result of time and dryness and the slight settling of the stone shelf over the centuries. It was not a flaw in the making, but a mark of long service. You picked up the lump of bitumen and turned it over in your hands. The surface was cool and slightly tacky to the touch, and it left a faint dark residue on your fingertips that smelled of earth and ancient sunlight and something else that had no name. Bitumen was a strange substance that seemed to belong partly to the world of stone and partly to the world of living things. It had flowed up from deep underground as a thick liquid and had slowly hardened over ages until it became this solid mass that could be carried and stored and used when needed. When heated, it would soften again and become workable, and when it cooled, it would harden into a waterproof seal that would last for generations. You broke off a small piece of the bitumen about the size of a thumbnail and placed it in a shallow depression that had been worn into the flat stone over years of similar work. The depression was stained dark from all the bitumen that had been softened there before, and the stain had penetrated deep into the grain of the sandstone. You added a pinch of the crushed limestone powder to the depression, letting it fall in a thin stream from between your fingers. The powder settled on and around the bitumen in a small pale mound that looked like snow on dark earth. The proportions were not measured in any formal way because the right proportion was something your hands knew from long practice. It was roughly 2 parts bitumen to 1 part limestone, but the exact ratio varied depending on the particular bitumen and the particular limestone and the particular crack. You took up the smooth river stone and began to work the materials together with a slow grinding motion. The stone pressed down on the bitumen and the limestone, and the pressure and the friction generated a slight warmth that softened the bitumen just enough to allow it to combine with the powder. The sound of the mixing was a soft, gritty scrape that repeated in a slow, steady rhythm. The black of the bitumen and the white of the limestone swirled together into a grey that gradually darkened as the mixing continued. The motion of the river stone was circular, with an occasional change of direction to fold the mixture back onto itself. The work required patience because the bitumen softened slowly, and the limestone needed to be incorporated evenly throughout the mass. The mixture reached the right consistency after a time that was measured not in minutes, but in the slow progression of the shadow of the acacia tree across the stone shelf. The shadow had moved perhaps the width of a hand since you began, and it would move another hand's width before the repair was complete. The mastic, when it was ready, was a uniform dark grey with a slight sheen and it held together in a cohesive mass that could be shaped and pressed and smoothed. It was not sticky in the way that fresh resin is sticky, but it was tacky enough to adhere to the dry clay of the jar. You set the river stone aside and picked up the thin piece of shaped bone. The bone tool had been made from the rib of a goat many years ago, and it had been shaped by scraping and polishing until it was smooth and flat, with a slightly pointed tip and a broader end for pressing. The bone had aged to a warm ivory color, and it was cool and light in your hand. You used the pointed tip to pick up a small amount of the mastic, and you carried it carefully to the top of the crack where the repair would begin. The mastic adhered to the bone easily, and it released just as easily when you pressed it into the narrow opening. You worked the material into the crack with a gentle, firm pressure, pushing it down into the space between the edges of the clay. The crack was narrow, and the mastic resisted at first because the air trapped inside had nowhere to go. You pressed and released and pressed again, and slowly the air escaped, in tiny bubbles that appeared at the surface of the mastic, and then vanished. The process moved down the length of the crack in small increments. You applied a portion of mastic and pressed it into place, and then you used the broader end of the bone tool to smooth the surface until it was flush with the surrounding clay. The smoothing motion was a single continuous stroke that traveled from the center of the repair outward to the edges, blending the mastic into the texture of the jar. The goal was not to hide the repair, but to make it a part of the jar, a new layer added to the history of the vessel. The dark grey line would remain visible against the reddish-brown clay, and anyone who looked closely would see that the jar had been mended. But the water would not seep through, and the jar would continue to hold its contents, and that was what mattered. Your hands moved with the same patient rhythm that they used for grinding grain and weaving cloth and drawing water from the cistern. The rhythm was slow and steady, and it required attention, but not concentration. Your mind could drift while your hands performed the familiar task, and your eyes could wander across the view of the valley below. The distant hills had changed color slightly as the afternoon advanced, shifting from a pale hazy blue to a deeper blue-gray that held the first hints of the evening to come. The acacia tree on the right of the view stirred in a faint breeze that you could not feel on the sheltered shelf. Its thin leaves moved against each other with a soft rustling sound that was too far away to hear, but easy to imagine. The crack was half filled now, and the line of dark mastic ran down the curve of the jar like a vein of some mineral that had formed in the clay. The repair was neat and even, and it followed the original crack with precision because your hands had learned to follow what was there, rather than imposing a straight line where none existed. The crack had its own path determined by the stresses in the clay and the firing and the years of use. The mastic followed that path exactly, filling every small irregularity and sealing every microscopic gap. The jar would be stronger at this point than it had been before the crack appeared, because the mastic was flexible in a way that the fired clay was not. It would give slightly as the jar expanded and contracted with changes in temperature and humidity, and it would hold fast where rigid clay might crack again. You paused to make more mastic because the first batch had been used up. The process of breaking off a new piece of bitumen and adding the limestone powder and working them together with the river stone repeated exactly as before. The sound of the grinding was the same soft, gritty scrape, and the motion of your hand was the same slow circle. The shadow of the acacia tree had moved further across the shelf, and a small patch of sunlight had appeared on the stone near your foot. The sunlight was warm when you shifted your position slightly and your toe entered the bright patch. The warmth was pleasant, and it reminded you that the sun was still high enough to matter even though the evening was approaching. You continued the repair, working your way down toward the base of the jar. The lower section of the crack was slightly wider than the upper section because the weight of the water inside the jar pressed outward more strongly near the bottom. You used a little more mastic here, pressing it deeper into the crack and smoothing it with extra care to ensure a complete seal. The bone tool moved in the same steady strokes, and the dark grey line grew longer and more complete. The jar sat motionless on the stone shelf, accepting the repair without protest. It had stood in this spot for so many years that it had become part of the shelf, and the shelf had become part of the mountain. The repair was just another small event in the long, quiet life of the vessel. A small black ant appeared on the stone near the bowl of water. It was exploring the surface with quick movements of its antennae, searching for anything that might be food or might be interesting. It found a tiny speck of limestone powder that had spilled during the mixing, and it investigated the speck thoroughly before determining that it was not what the ant was looking for. The ant moved on and disappeared into a crack in the stone that was much too narrow for your eyes to follow. The ant had its own repairs to make somewhere in the depths of the rock, and its own rhythms of work and rest, and its own small place in the slow life of the mountain. The repair was nearly complete. Only a small section remained at the very bottom of the crack, where it tapered to a fine hairline and disappeared into the curve of the base. You applied a final small amount of mastic and pressed it into place and smoothed it with the tip of the bone tool. Then you set the tool aside and examined the full length of the repair with your eyes and with the tips of your fingers. The mastic was smooth and even, and it had filled the crack completely. There were no gaps and no thin spots and no places where the seal might fail. The jar was whole again in the only way that mattered. You took up the small clay bowl of water and dipped a corner of a clean cloth into it. The cloth was a scrap of worn linen that had once been part of a garment and was now used for cleaning and wiping and other small tasks. You used the damp cloth to clean the bone tool, removing the traces of bitumen that clung to its surface. The bitumen dissolved slightly in the water, leaving a faint grey smear on the cloth that would never wash out completely. Then you cleaned your fingers, which had accumulated a thin coating of the dark mastic during the work. The bitumen came away slowly, requiring several passes of the damp cloth and a little rubbing with a pinch of the fine dust from the shelf. When your hands were clean, you rinsed the cloth in the remaining water and spread it on the warm stone to dry. The jar sat on the shelf, with its new repair visible as a dark line against the reddish clay. The mastic would take several days to cure, completely hardening as the volatile components of the bitumen slowly evaporated into the dry air. During that time, the jar would not be filled with water, but would be left empty to allow the seal to set. The smaller jars would serve for the household needs until this one was ready. The interruption was so minor that it barely registered as a change in the rhythm of the days. Water would still be drawn from the cistern and carried up the corridor and stored in the corner of the sleeping chamber. The only difference was that the water would rest in a different vessel for a short while. You remained seated on the shelf for a time after the work was finished. The sun had moved further, and the patch of light that had warmed your foot was gone, replaced by the uniform shade of the overhang. The valley below was beginning to take on the deeper colors of late afternoon, with the shadows lengthening across the pale floor and the distant hills darkening against the sky. The acacia tree was still now, because the breeze had died away, and its thin leaves hung motionless in the still air. The ant had not returned, and the stone shelf was quiet, except for the faint sound of your own breathing. The jar had been on this shelf when your grandparents were young, and it had been repaired then by hands that were now dust. The repair you had just made would last for many years, and then it would need to be made again by someone else sitting on this same shelf using the same bitumen and the same limestone powder and the same patient motions. The jar would outlast everyone now alive, and it would continue to hold water drawn from the deep cistern, and it would continue to stand on this shelf overlooking the valley. The crack would be sealed again and again, and the dark lines of old repairs would accumulate on the surface like the rings of a tree, marking the passage of time in a language that anyone could read if they took the time to look. You stood up slowly and stretched your back, which had grown stiff from the long sitting. The repair was finished, and the tools were clean, and the afternoon was drawing toward its close. You left the jar on the shelf where it would rest until the mastic had cured, and the water could be trusted to stay inside. The bone tool went back into its place in a niche in the wall, and the lump of bitumen went back into its clay pot, and the river stone was set aside for the next time it would be needed. The shelf was tidy, and the view was peaceful, and there was nothing more to do here. You turned and walked back along the narrow path that led from the shelf to the main terrace of the village. The path was worn smooth by the same feet that had walked it for generations, and your sandals made the same soft scraping sound that they always made. The village was quiet in the late afternoon, with the awnings casting long shadows and the goats beginning to drift down from their slopes. The evening tasks were waiting, and the night would come in its own time. The jar stood on its shelf behind you, holding the memory of the repair in its dark grey seam, and it would stand there through the night and through the night dew, the next day and through all the days that would follow. The crack was sealed, and the water would stay, and the slow life of the village would continue exactly as it had always continued. The moon had risen over the eastern rim of the valley while the village slept, and its light was a cold silver that turned the sandstone into something that resembled bone. The color of the stone during the day was a warm rose and a soft gold, and 100 shades of earth that shifted with the angle of the sun. Under the moon all of that warmth was gone, and the village was a place of pale greys and deep blacks, and the faint blue tint that moonlight always carries with it from the cold places between the stars. The dwellings carved into the cliff face looked like the empty sockets of a skull, and the terraces were flat plains of silver that seemed to float above the darker voids of the valley below. You were not awake to see this transformation. You lay on the sleeping platform in the chamber with the window facing east, and the moonlight had not yet found its way through the opening because the moon was still low, and the cliff above cast a long shadow that covered the entire village. The room was dark except for the faintest glow from the dying embers in the hearth, a deep red pulse that was more a memory of light than light itself. Your breathing was slow and regular, and your body was still under the wool blanket. The night was deep and the village was silent, and the moonlight was creeping down the face of the cliff with a patience that nothing human could match. The shadow of the funerary monument fell across the central gathering space of the village. The monument was a tall, narrow pillar of solid rock that had been left standing when the rest of the cliff face was carved away to create the terraces and the dwellings. It was not a building, but a piece of the mountain itself, isolated from the main mass by the work of ancient hands. Its purpose was lost to memory, and no one in the village thought about it anymore, except as a landmark and a place where the children sometimes played in the cool of the evening. At night, it was simply a dark shape against the lighter darkness of the sky, a vertical absence that the moonlight had to navigate around. The shadow of the monument began at its base, where the pale stone of the gathering space met the darker stone of the pillar. It stretched out across the compacted earth of the central area in a long black rectangle that was sharp-edged and absolute. The moonlight was bright enough to cast a shadow that had clear boundaries, and the line between the silver of the lit ground and the black of the shadow was as crisp as anything seen in the full light of day. The shadow pointed toward the west, because the moon was in the east, and it lay across the ground like a dark finger, indicating some destination that did not exist. You turned slightly on the sleeping mat, and your hand moved from beside your head to rest on the wool blanket over your chest. The movement was unconscious, and it did not disturb your sleep. The chamber was cool now that the fire had died and the stone walls had released their stored heat into the night air. The coolness was not uncomfortable because the wool blanket was warm and your body had adjusted its temperature to match the slow cooling of the room. You slept on, and the moonlight continued its descent of the cliff face, and the shadow of the monument continued its slow crawl across the gathering space. The shadow was not still. It moved with the same inexorable slowness that governed everything in the village, but at night that slowness was made visible in a way that the daylight hours obscured. The moon traveled across the sky at a pace that was too slow for the eye to perceive, but the shadow it cast was a clock that marked that motion. The leading edge of the monument's shadow crept across the compacted earth at a rate that could be measured in the width of a finger over the span of 100 slow breaths. It advanced over the small stones and the packed dust and the scattered fragments of dried vegetation that had been tracked into the gathering space during the day. Each small obstacle was overtaken in its turn, and the shadow flowed over it without pause or acknowledgement. A discarded date palm frond lay in the path of the advancing shadow. The frond had been dropped there earlier in the day by someone who had been weaving a basket or repairing a section of awning. It was a single dried leaf about the length of a person's arm, and it was a pale brown color that was almost the same as the earth it rested on. The frond was slightly curved, and its edges were frayed into thin fibers that caught the moonlight and glowed with a soft silver sheen. The shadow of the monument reached the tip of the frond and began to swallow it inch by inch. The progress was so slow that if you had been watching, you would have grown tired of watching long before the shadow reached the middle of the leaf. But you were not watching, and no one was watching. The shadow advanced alone and unseen, and the frond surrendered to the darkness without resistance. The pattern of the frond's fibers created a texture in the shadow that was different from the smooth darkness that covered the bare earth. The moonlight that passed through the frayed edges cast a faint dappled pattern at the boundary between light and dark, a pattern that shifted as the shadow moved and the angle of the light changed. The pattern was too faint to be seen from any distance, and it existed only for itself, a small complexity in the vast simple geometry of the night. The shadow continued to move, and the front was fully engulfed, and the dappled pattern vanished, and the edge of the shadow was sharp and clean once more. The moon climbed higher, and its light grew stronger. The shadow of the cliff face that had been covering the village began to withdraw upward, exposing the lower terraces to the silver illumination. The window of your sleeping chamber remained dark because the window faced east, and the moon was now in the southeast, and its light fell on the outer wall rather than through the opening. The chamber was a pocket of deep shadow in a village that was slowly being transformed by the rising moon. The water jar in the corner was invisible, and the grinding stone was a vague shape against the wall, and the woven rug was a field of darkness that merged with the darkness of the floor. Only the faint red pulse of the embers remained as a point of reference, a small warm heart in the cold silver night. The shadow of the monument had now crossed more than half of the gathering space. It had passed over the date palm frond and a small round stone that had been worn smooth by the passage of feet, and the shallow depression where water collected during the rare rains. The depression was dry now, and its bottom was cracked into a pattern of interlocking polygons that looked like the shell of a tortoise. The shadow flowed into the depression and filled it with darkness, and the cracks disappeared, and the depression became just another part of the advancing night. The edge of the shadow was now approaching the low stone wall that marked the boundary of the gathering space on its western side. The wall was a simple construction of uncut stones fitted together without mortar in the ancient manner. It was not high perhaps to the knee of a standing person, and its purpose was not to keep anything out or in, but simply to define the edge of the flat area. The stones were of various sizes and shapes, and they had been selected from the hillside and carried to this spot and placed in positions where their natural contours allowed them to rest securely against their neighbors. The wall had stood for so long that the stones had settled into a permanent arrangement, and small plants had found root in the gaps between them. At night, the plants were dark shapes against the pale stone, and their leaves hung limp and still in the motionless air. The leading edge of the shadow touched the first stone of the wall. The stone was a rough, irregular block of limestone that was lighter in color than the sandstone of the village proper. The moonlight had been illuminating its upper surface with a pale glow, and now that glow was extinguished as the shadow advanced. The transition from light to dark took place over a span of time that was too long to witness as an event. The stone simply was lit, and then it was not, and there was no moment when the change could be said to have occurred. The shadow climbed the face of the stone and reached its top, and then it spilled over onto the far side, where a small patch of bare earth lay between the wall and the beginning of the steep slope down to the next terrace. The moonlight on the far side of the wall was still bright and untouched. The earth there was a pale grey, and the small stones that littered the surface cast their own tiny shadows that pointed away from the moon. These shadows were short and sharp, and they would not move significantly during the remainder of the night because the moon was now high enough that its motion was more vertical than horizontal. The shadows of the small stones would shorten further as the moon approached its zenith, and then they would begin to lengthen again on the opposite side as the moon descended toward the western rim. But that was hours away, and for now the shadows were still, and the moonlight was bright, and the village was suspended in the deep silence of the middle night. The sound of the wind was the only sound that moved through the village. It was not a strong wind, but a faint movement of air that flowed down from the high plateau and through the clefts and corridors of the cliff face. The wind made a soft sighing sound as it passed over the openings of the dwellings, a sound that was almost like breathing, if breathing could be slowed to the pace of the stone itself. The sound rose and fell in a slow rhythm that had nothing to do with the wind's own motion, but was created by the shape of the passages it flowed through. The dwellings were like a great instrument carved from the mountain, and the wind played a single low note that went on and on without variation. You shifted again on the sleeping mat, and this time your eyes opened for a moment without awareness. The chamber was dark, and the embers were a faint red glow in the hearth, and your eyes registered these things without sending any message to your waking mind. You turned onto your other side and pulled the wool blanket closer around your shoulders, and your eyes closed again, and you returned to the deep place where sleep takes you, when the night is long and the world is still. The wind sighed through the corridors, and the moonlight painted the village in silver and black, and the shadow of the monument continued its patient journey across the gathering space. The shadow had now crossed the low stone wall completely and was advancing across the narrow strip of earth on the far side. The edge of the shadow was approaching a small thorny plant that grew from a crack in the rock at the very edge of the terrace. The plant was a variety of acacia that had adapted to the dry conditions by growing slowly and keeping its leaves small and its thorns long. During the day, it was a dusty greenish-grey that blended with the stone around it. Under the moonlight, it was a pale silver shape, with dark shadows pooling beneath its branches. The shadow of the monument reached the outermost thorns of the plant and began to engulf them one by one. The thorns disappeared into the darkness, and then the small leaves, and then the twisted branches. The plant made no sound and offered no resistance. It simply became part of the shadow, as everything else had become part of the shadow. The moon was now high enough that its light fell directly into the window of your sleeping chamber. The beam that entered was narrow, and it fell across the floor in a pale rectangle that touched the edge of the woven rug and the base of the water jar. The light was cold and silver, and it made the terracotta of the jar look like something carved from ice. The dust motes that had drifted in the warm sunbeam of the morning were gone now, settled onto the surfaces of the room. The moonbeam was clear and empty, and it lay across the floor without illuminating anything except the texture of the stone and the weave of the rug. Your face was turned away from the window, and the light did not reach your eyes. You slept undisturbed, and the moonbeam crept slowly across the floor as the moon continued its arc. The shadow of the monument had reached the edge of the terrace where the ground fell away to the steep slope below. The leading edge of the shadow hung in the empty air for a moment, as if uncertain whether to continue, and then it tipped over the edge and began to descend the slope. The slope was a jumble of loose stones and dry vegetation, and the shadow flowed over it, like a dark liquid, following the contours of the ground. The individual stones disappeared into the darkness, one after another, and the pale silver of the moonlight was replaced by the absolute black of the shadow. The progress of the shadow down the slope was faster than its progress across the flat ground, because the angle of the slope matched the angle of the moonlight, and the shadow stretched and lengthened as it descended. A small night bird called from somewhere higher up the cliff face. The call was a single soft note that hung in the still air for a moment and then faded. The bird did not call again, and the silence returned, and the note was forgotten. The bird was a small brown creature that spent its days hiding in crevices and its nights hunting insects among the rocks. Its call was not a song, but a location signal, a way of letting other birds know where it was without revealing too much. The call had come and gone, and the night continued exactly as before. The shadow of the monument had now descended the slope and was spreading across the next terrace, down where the villagers grew small patches of grain and vegetables in the thin soil. The terrace was a flat strip of earth, held in place by a retaining wall of stacked stones. The plants that grew there were small and hardy, and they survived on the moisture that collected in the soil during the rare rains and the dew that formed on their leaves in the cool of the night. Under the moonlight, the terrace was a pale silver field, with the darker shapes of the plants arranged in uneven rows. The shadow of the monument fell across the terrace, and the plants disappeared into the darkness, and the silver field was divided into two halves, one bright and one dark. The division was not permanent. The shadow continued to move, and the line between light and dark advanced across the terrace at the same slow pace that had advanced across the gathering space. A small cluster of barley plants was overtaken by the shadow, and their pale stalks vanished into the blackness. A single wild flower that had somehow found root among the cultivated plants disappeared a moment later. The shadow did not distinguish between the plants that the villagers had planted and the plants that had arrived on their own. It covered them all equally and moved on. The moon had passed its zenith and was beginning its slow descent toward the western hills. The angle of the light changed by a tiny amount, and the shadows that had been shortening for hours now began to lengthen again on the opposite side of every object. The shadow of the monument, which had been stretching toward the west, now began to swing slowly toward the north as the moon's position in the sky shifted. The motion was too slow to see, but it was happening, and the geometry of the night was in constant, subtle motion. The village and the terraces and the slopes and the valley below were all part of a vast, slow clock that measured the passage of the night in shadows and moonlight and the imperceptible turning of the earth. The moonbeam in your sleeping chamber had moved from the floor to the wall. It now illuminated a section of the carved sandstone, where the chisel marks of the ancient builders were still visible. The marks were a series of parallel grooves that ran diagonally across the surface, and they caught the moonlight and held it in a way that the smooth stone did not. The grooves glowed with a faint silver light that made them look like the ribs of some great stone creature sleeping in the wall. Your breathing was slow and deep, and your body was still. The night was more than half gone, and the village remained suspended in its silver silence. The shadow of the monument had now crossed the lower terrace and was flowing down the steep natural slope beyond the cultivated area. The slope was a wilderness of broken rock and thorny scrub that no one visited except the goats and the occasional hunter. The shadow moved across this wild ground with the same patient indifference that it had shown to the gathering space and the stone wall and the barley plants. It covered the sharp edges of the fractured limestone and the twisted branches of the acacia and the small caves where the rock doves slept, with their heads tucked under their wings. The doves did not stir as the shadow passed over them. They slept on in their dark crevices, and the shadow moved on, and the moonlight returned to the places it had left behind. The moon was now low in the western sky, and its light had taken on a faint, warm tint that was the first hint of the approaching dawn. The silver of the high night was fading into a softer color that had no name, because it existed only in the brief transition between the cold light of the moon and the warm light of the sun. The shadow of the monument had stretched to an impossible length, reaching far down the slope and into the darkness of the valley below, where it merged with the shadows of the mountains and became indistinguishable from the general darkness of the night. The first grey light of dawn began to seep into the eastern sky. It was not yet light enough to see by, but it was light enough to feel as a change in the quality of the darkness. The stars that had been bright overhead were fading, and the moon was sinking toward the western hills. The shadow of the monument, which had been the dominant feature of the village for hours, began to weaken as the moonlight was diluted by the growing brightness in the east. The sharp edge of the shadow softened, and the deep black of its center faded to a dark gray that was barely distinguishable from the lit ground around it. The moonbeam in your sleeping chamber faded and disappeared as the moon sank below the level of the window. The room returned to the deep shadow of the night, but the quality of that shadow was different now. It was not the absolute darkness of the middle night, but a darkness that held the memory of the coming light. Your body sensed this change on some level below waking, and your breathing shifted slightly toward the shallower rhythm of the approaching morning. You were not yet awake, but you were no longer in the deepest part of sleep. The shadow of the monument was gone, now dissolved into the general dimness of the pre-dawn world. The gathering space was a uniform grey, and the stone wall was a darker grey against the lighter grey of the earth. The date palm frond was visible again as a pale shape on the ground, and the small round stone and the cracked depression. The objects that had been hidden by the shadow for hours had returned to the visible world, and they waited in the grey light for the sun to rise and restore their colours. The night was over, and the village was still. The long, slow journey of the moon shadow across the terraces and the slopes and the valley below was complete. The geometry of the night had played out its silent pattern, and the earth had turned by exactly the amount that it always turned in the hours between sunset and sunrise. The shadow would return with the next moon and the moon after that, and it would follow the same path across the same ground at the same patient pace. The frond would be gone by then, blown away by the wind or carried off for some use. But another frond would take its place, or a stone or a fallen leaf. The shadow would find whatever lay in its path, and it would cover it and move on, and the village would sleep through it all as it had slept through this night, and as it would sleep through all the nights to come. The light that entered the sleeping chamber on this morning was different from the light that had entered on all the mornings before. The difference was not something that could be named or measured in any simple way. It was a difference in the angle and the color and the weight of the illumination that fell across the woven rug and touched the base of the water jar. The sun had shifted its path across the sky by a small amount each day since the season began, and the accumulation of those small amounts had finally reached a point where the change became noticeable. The beam that had once fallen on the third knot from the edge of the rug now fell on the fourth knot. The patch of warmth that had climbed the wall beside the sleeping platform now climbed a different section of the wall where a faint vein of darker mineral ran through the sandstone. You opened your eyes and the quality of the light told you what your body already knew. The season was turning. It was not turning in the way that a page turns, with a sharp sound and a clear division between what came before and what comes after. It was turning in the way that a very large and very heavy stone turns, balanced on a single point and moving so slowly that the motion can only be detected by looking away and looking back again after a long while. The warmth of the sun on your face through the window opening was slightly less intense than it had been in the weeks before. The air in the chamber was slightly cooler when you pushed back the wool blanket. The dust motes in the beam of light drifted with a slightly different laziness, as if the air itself had grown a little thicker with the approach of the changing season. You sat up on the sleeping platform and placed your feet on the packed earth floor. The floor was cool against your soles in a way that it had not been at the height of the warm season. The coolness was not unpleasant, and it was not the deep cold of winter. It was simply a reminder that the earth was beginning its long, slow release of the heat it had stored during the months of direct sun. The stone walls of the chamber felt the same coolness when you pressed your palm against them. They had been warm to the touch at dawn for as long as you could remember, and now they were neutral, neither warm nor cool, but resting in a balance that would soon tip toward the cool side of the scale. You walked to the window opening and looked out across the valley. The view was the same view that you had seen every morning of your life, and yet it was different in the way that a familiar face is different after a long absence. The haze over the valley floor was thinner than it had been, and the distant hills on the far side were a sharper blue against the pale sky. The light itself had a clarity that belonged to the cooler part of the year, a clarity that made the edges of things more distinct. The dry watercourse on the valley floor was visible as a dark line winding through the pale earth, and you could see the individual shadows of the larger boulders that dotted its course. In the height of the warm season, those shadows had been soft and blurred by the heat rising from the ground. Now they were sharp and clean, as if drawn with a fine stick of charcoal. The path to the cistern was cooler than it had been in many weeks. You walked down the worn groove in the center of the corridor, and the stone underfoot was no longer warm from the ambient heat of the day. It was cool and slightly damp in the way that it always was in the deep parts of the mountain, but now that coolness extended further up the corridor toward the surface. The moisture on the walls was more pronounced, and the droplets that formed on the rough surface caught the light from the slit windows and glowed with a soft silver color. The sound of the cistern reached you earlier than usual, because the air was denser and it carried the drip more clearly. The drip itself had not changed its rhythm. It fell with the same irregular patience that it had always fallen, but the sound seemed louder now, or perhaps it was only that your ears were more attuned to it in the cooler silence of the turning season. You filled the water jar as you always filled it, and the water was the same cold temperature that it always was. The deep cistern did not know about seasons, and its water remained constant regardless of what happened on the surface. You carried the full jar back up the corridor, and your breath formed a faint cloud in front of your face, for the first time in many months. The cloud was thin and it dissipated almost immediately, but it was there and it was a sign. The season was turning and the air was cooling, and the rhythm of the village was shifting by a fraction of a degree toward the slower pace of the time to come. The grinding stone waited on its platform in the corner of the chamber. You sat on the low ledge and reached for the basket of grain, and your hands moved through the familiar motions without thought. The upper stone scraped across the lower stone, and the sound was the same sound it had always been. The dust rose in its fine pale cloud and hung in the still air, but the dust settled more quickly now, because the air was heavier and the particles did not float as long as they had in the dry heat of the warmer season. You noticed this without really noticing it, in the way that you noticed all the small changes that marked the passage of time in the village. The flour accumulated in the bowl, and the basket of grain grew empty, and the morning passed in the same slow measure that it always passed. The courtyard awning stirred in a breeze that came from a different direction than the breezes of the warm season. The wind had shifted its path around the mountain, and it now flowed down from the high plateau with a coolness that carried the scent of the higher elevations. The scent was faint and clean, and it smelled of stone that had never been warmed by the sun, and of the thin dry plants that grew in the crevices of the summit. The goat hair awning rustled with a different sound, a crisper sound, because the fibers were drier now that the humidity of the air had dropped. The spots of light on the packed earth floor were sharper, and they moved more slowly across the ground because the sun was lower in the sky even at midday. You sat at the loom, and the shuttle passed back and forth and the beater thumped against the growing fabric. The rhythm was the same, but the quality of the work was different in a way that only your hands could feel. The wool of the weft thread was slightly stiffer, because the cooler air had drawn the last traces of lanolin deeper into the fibers. The shuttle required a slightly firmer push to pass through the shed. The beater swung with a slightly heavier thump because the wood of the loom had contracted by a tiny amount in the drier air. These differences were so small that they could not be described to anyone who had not spent hundreds of hours at this same loom in all the seasons of the year. They were the language that the loom spoke to the weaver, and they told the story of the turning season in a vocabulary of tension and friction and the subtle behavior of wool and wood. The goats on the hillside had grown thicker coats. You could see it from the village terrace when you looked up at the slope where they grazed. Their hair was longer and denser, and it moved differently in the wind. The old female on her outcrop looked bulkier than she had in the warm months, and the young goat with the pale cream coat was now a soft, fuzzy shape against the grey limestone. The goats knew about the turning season in a way that went deeper than knowledge. Their bodies responded to the changing length of the days and the cooling of the nights, and they prepared for what was coming without any need for thought or decision. They grew their winter coats, and they sought out the last of the dry vegetation in the sheltered hollows, and they moved a little more slowly, as if conserving something that would be needed later. The climb to the high place was different on this day. The steps were the same, and the handrail groove was the same, and the view from the saddle was the same, but the wind that met you at the gap between the peaks was cooler, and it carried a hint of the moisture that would eventually fall as rain on the high plateau. The moisture was not yet rain, and it would not be rain for some time, but it was a promise written in the texture of the air. The lizard that clung to the ball beside the path was slower to move when you passed, and its color had shifted slightly toward a darker shade that would absorb more of the weakening sun. The small brown bird that hovered in the wind was gone now, migrated to some warmer place, or simply moved to a lower elevation where the air was less thin. The summit platform was the same flat expanse of dark stone, and the view was the same vast empty valley. But the haze was thinner, and the colors were sharper, and the silence seemed deeper, because the insects of the warm season had fallen quiet. The hearth fire in the evening was built with a little more care now. You added an extra juniper twig to the initial triangle, and you placed the dung cakes closer together so that they would burn longer and produce more heat. The smoke rose in its thin ribbon and curled toward the vent hole, and the smell of the burning dung was the same earthy scent it had always been. But the warmth of the fire was more welcome now, and you sat closer to the hearth than you had in the warmer evenings. The embers glowed with the same deep red, and the shadows danced on the walls in the same slow patterns. The difference was only in the way your body leaned toward the heat and the way your hands stretched out to catch the warmth before it escaped up the vent hole. The storage jar on the rock shelf had cured completely. The dark grey line of the repair was hard and smooth, and it had bonded with the reddish clay in a way that made the jar whole again. You ran your finger over the mended crack and felt the slight difference in texture between the original clay and the bitumen seal. The difference was small, and it would become smaller as the seasons passed and the mastic aged and weathered to match the surface around it. The jar was filled with water now, and it held the water without any seep or darkening of the clay. The repair had been successful, and the jar would continue to stand on the shelf for many more seasons and many more repairs. The moon rose later now, and its path across the sky was different. The shadow of the funerary monument fell at a steeper angle across the gathering space, and it reached the low stone wall more quickly than it had in the warmer nights. The moonlight itself was colder, and it turned the sandstone into a pale blue-grey that was even more like bone than the silver of the earlier season. The date palm frond had been carried away by the wind weeks ago, and a new frond had not yet fallen to take its place. The shadow crossed the bare earth and the small round stone and the cracked depression, and there was nothing to mark its passage except the slow extinguishing of the moonlight on the ground. The night bird had fallen silent, and the wind through the corridors was a lower note because the air was denser. The village slept under the cold moon, and the shadow moved across the terraces and the slopes, and the valley below, and the night passed in the same deep silence. The extra blanket was a simple thing made of coarse wool that had been woven on the same loom in some previous season. It had been stored in a niche in the wall during the warm months, and it smelled faintly of the stone and the dust and the smoke. that had accumulated in its fibers over years of use. You took it from the niche and shook it gently, and a small cloud of fine dust rose into the air and settled on the floor. The blanket was heavier than the single covering you had been using, and it was slightly rough against your skin when you pulled it up to your chin. But the weight was a comfort, and the roughness was familiar, and you settled into the sleeping platform with the extra warmth wrapped around you. The morning light would come a little later each day now. The angle of the sun would continue to shift, and the beam through the window would fall on different knots of the rug and different sections of the wall. The cistern would remain the same. Cool darkness, and the drip would continue its irregular rhythm. The grinding stone would wait on its platform, and the shuttle would pass back and forth through the shed, and the goats would graze on the slopes in their thicker coats. The village would continue exactly as it had continued through all the seasons before this one, and as it would continue through all the seasons to come. You closed your eyes, and the warmth of the extra blankets settled around you like a second layer of stillness. The chamber was dark, and the embers in the hearth were a faint red glow that would fade to black before the deep night was over. The wind sighed through the corridors, and the moon crossed the sky, and the earth turned beneath the village. The season had shifted by a small amount, and it would shift again by another small amount tomorrow and the day after. The changes were so gradual that they could not be perceived as they happened. They could only be noticed after they had accumulated into something large enough to name. And by then the new season would be fully arrived, and the old season would be a memory, and the rhythm of the village would have adjusted to the new angle of the light, and the new coolness of the air, and the new weight of the extra blanket on the sleeping platform. The long, slow morning of the high village continued. The sun climbed the sky, and the light warmed the sandstone, and the dust drifted in the beams. The water dripped in the cistern, and the shuttle passed through the warp, and the goats stood on their outcrops watching the empty valley. The village was still, and the day was long, and there was nothing that needed to be done except to continue. And so the village continued, suspended in the amber light of the turning season on the high cliffs above Petra. And the silence was deep, and the peace was complete, and the story of the quiet season came to its soft and patient end.